Chapter 24 of Flaming Youth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by MrsLSid. Flaming Youth by Samuel Hopkins Adams, Chapter 24. He walked back with her to Holiday Knoll after dinner. Pat's face was thoughtful, moody. As they paced in silence, he studied it intently, with passionate longings, with passionate misgivings. Out of a reverie, she spoke. "I've never missed anyone in my life as I've missed you. You were right." "About what, Pat?" "That day you took me to Philadelphia, you said I'd miss you more than I thought. Do you remember? I told you then what I thought about it. 'Oh, well, I'll miss him for a few days, and then poof!'" There followed the impatient, boyish wriggle and hunch of the lithe shoulders. "It'll be all over." It wasn't all over. "For me, it has never been over. Not for a single minute." "Have you wanted me so much?" Beneath the conscious coquetry, there was a more wistful note. "Oh, God, Pat." His voice sounded thick and rough. "There has been no color, no savor, no music or fragrance in life without you." "Why did you go away?" she demanded accusingly. "You know, I had to go." "Why did you come back?" "Not to see you. I didn't want to see you. Dee told me that you were away." "She told me you were here. I'd phoned over about some clothes, so I just thought I'd like to see you again. Don't scowl at me. You look as if you think I ought not to have come." "No, you oughtn't." "Are you sorry I did?" He looked away from her into the wind-swept night. "Are you angry because I did?" "I love you," he burst out. "God, how I love you." She laughed softly. Her hand slid down his arm, clasped for a moment the wrist in which his pulses leapt madly to her touch, wreathed itself, cool and strong and smooth, around his palm. "And I love you," she half-whispered gaily. "I'm terribly in love with you," a pause of deliberate intent, "tonight, because you've been away from me so long." "Ah, yes, tonight." He made no effort to keep the bitterness out of his voice. "But tomorrow—" "Tonight's tonight," she broke in happily. "We've got lots of it to ourselves. It's only 9 o'clock. I broke away early on purpose." Arrested by the look on his face, she added with exasperation and protest, "Carrie, you're not going to play propriety tonight, when we haven't seen each other for so long?" She shook the gleamy mist of her hair about her face, gave a gnomish bend and twist to body and neck, and peered sidelong at him from out the tangle. Suddenly her face darted upward, her mouth met his in a grotesque parody of a passion-laden kiss. "Oh, bad bunny!" she admonished herself in mock reproach. He stopped, gazing at her from beneath bent brows. "You hated that, didn't you?" she said. "Yes." "Because it wasn't real?" "Because it was mockery." "Petite gamine stuff." "But I'm not petite gamine tonight. I'm something else. I don't know what I am. Do you?" "No." "Don't be cross with me. Whatever it is that I am, it's sorry that it kissed you that way. I didn't mean to make a josh of it." He smiled. "One might as well try to be cross with a moonbeam." They had come around by the side street, and now he held the garden gate back for her. The house was dim. Pat kissed her hand to the clematis arbor. "Do you remember?" she murmured. "Is there one moment ever spent with you that I've forgotten?" "Would you like to forget?" "There are times when I would give anything in the world to forget." "But I don't want you to forget." "You want me to have to bear this always?" "No. I don't want you to be unhappy about it. I don't know what I do want, except now. Now I want to have this evening just to ourselves." She opened a side door, spoke to a servant moving about in the kitchen. "It's all right, Katie." Then to Scott, "Aren't you coming in?" He hesitated, but when she added impatiently, "Oh, don't be such a crab," he followed her. "Go into the small conservatory," she bade him. "That's my work. I fussed it up into a sort of den." She bounded upstairs and ran into her room, shook out her hair, gathered it, studied herself in the glass. Her eyes were brilliant, heavy-lidded, dreamy. She shook herself impatiently. Her strong, supervitalized young body felt cramped and pent in the close-fitting tailor-made which she had on. She plucked at the buttons with hurried fingers, wriggled out of the garment which she kicked from her feet and left lying on the floor, tossed her corsets after it, and exhaled a long, luxurious "oof" of satisfaction and voluptuous relief. Opening the door of her clothes press, she rummaged for a moment and pulled out a long, sweeping robe, which she drew about her, molding it to the boyish set of her shoulders and the woman's depth and contour of her bosom. She caught up a cigarette, lighted a match, then, lapsing into thought, let it droop from her fingers until the scorching brought an angry "damn" of pain. She threw the cigarette after the expiring match. No, she wouldn't smoke, much as her tense nerves demanded it. She would keep her mouth fresh and sweet for Carrie's first kiss. She ran down to him, putting on a far light in the hallway so that only a dim glow invaded the conservatory den. Scott stood at the window in an attitude of attention. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Listening." "Music! A violin. Oh, I know. It's a visitor at the Eastmans next door. He's good. And how flawless of him to be playing just now. Open the window. Let's hear it all." He obeyed. She drew in to him. Her ready fingers sought his palm. "Want me to mix you a drink?" "No, dear." "That's better," she approved, though she added with her old air of gaminerie, "It might go further and not get a call down. What is it he's playing?" "The Elegy." The violin was sobbing, panting, pleading like a woman in sweet distress. The wind swept the notes to them until the whole room was surcharged with the passion and grief of it. Pat lifted Scott's hand, cuddled it to her cheek, flipped it away carelessly, turned from him, drifted out of the den into the hallway, back again, and to the divan in the far corner, where she threw herself, snuggling amidst the pillows. Her eyes grew heavy, languorous. In their depths played a shadowed gleam like the far reflection of flame in the heart of somber waters. The long, thrilling, haunted, wind-born prayer of the violin penetrated to the innermost fiber of her, mingling there with the passionate sense of his nearness, swaying her to undefined and flashing languors, to unthinkable urgencies. "Oh, Carrie," she breathed in the breaking seduction of her voice, a voice that blended and was one with the resistless pleading of the music. And again, "Oh, Carrie." Her arms yearned out to him, drawing him through the dimness. With a cry he leapt to her, clasped her, felt her young strength and lissome grace yield to his enfoldment. Through her sundered lips he drew the wine of her breath deep, deep into his veins, until all his self was merged and lost in her passion. Outside, the great wind possessed the world, full of the turbulence, the fever, the unassuaged desire of spring, the allegro furioso of the elements, and through it pierced the unbearable sweetness of the stringed melody. The strain died. Was it after a minute, or an hour, or a night that was an age in their intertwined lives? He was back at the window, leaning against the casement, drawing the rushing wind into his lungs, his heart bursting, his soul a whirl of fire. Behind him in the gloom sounded the shaken softness of her breathing. He bent his head upon his arms. "Oh, God," he said. "Pat, little Pat." She came to him then, spread her gracious arms wide, flung the gleaming fog of her hair to the wind, enclasped him, claimed his soul with her lips. "I'm not sorry," she panted. I'm not. I'm glad." End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Flaming Youth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by MrsLSid. Flaming Youth by Samuel Hopkins Adams, Chapter 25. Nothing irked Pat more than being awakened too early. Consequently, Katie's knock upon her door, at the third discreet repetition, elicited a plaintive growl of protest. "Oh, go away." "Special delivery letter for you, Miss Pat." "Shove it under the door and don't bother me." She flumped over in bed, burrowing her face among the pillows like an annoyed baby. Very much did Pat wish to sleep. Until long after midnight she had lain awake, thinking excitedly. To be roused out of the profound oblivion which she had finally achieved, thus untimely, was a little too much. But that letter got between her and her rest. From Carrie Scott, of course. She visualized the oblong blue stamp, insistent, intrusive, immediate. Oh, well. Up she jumped, caught the envelope from the floor, and dived back into bed to read it. It was mainly repetition of what he had said last night when they parted. Nothing but the absolute necessity of going would have taken him away from her at such a time. He would be back in a few days at the latest. She must wait until then, must not let herself worry, must not make herself unhappy, must trust in him. It ended, "I love you, Pat." Through the quiet directness of the wording, Pat felt the stress of an overwhelming emotion. It was not so much worry or unhappiness that filled Pat's thoughts as a confused and colorful bewilderment, a sense of unreality. There intervened a reflection from her miseducation through the media of flash fiction and the conventional false moralizings of the screen. In a variety of presentations they all taught the same lesson, that when girls went wrong, they invariably got into trouble. She passed her hands down along her slender, boyish body and experienced a sharp qualm of fear and disgust and anger, a visualization of gross and sodden changes in those slim contours. It couldn't happen to her. In spite of the movies, other girls took a chance and got away with it. Ada Clare, for instance, according to common gossip, nothing had happened to her. Sissy Parmenter had lightly hinted at experiences. Pat thought it would be exciting to tell Sissy, but would it be safe? She would like to have Sissy's reassurance that everything would be all right. But why should she need reassurance? She steadied herself with the thought, entertained wholly without idea of blasphemy or irreverence, that God wouldn't let anything like that come about, the God to whom she had paid such assiduous homage by going regularly to church and asking every night for what she specifically wanted on the morrow or in the further future. It was her naive idea of an unwritten pact with the deity that the performance of her little ritual, be it never so self-seeking, entitled her, of right, to definite rewards and exemptions, claimable as required. This was one of them. Surely he would keep to his part of the bargain. Otherwise, what good would religion be to anyone? It occurred to her uncomfortably that he had somewhere said, "The wages of sin is death," which she secretly deemed bad grammar, even if it was in the Bible. But Pat did not really feel that this was sin. Rather, it was accident. Technically, it might be sin, she admitted so much. But if it were really sin, she would, as a sound Christian, feel remorse. And she did not feel remorse. Therefore, it could not in any sense be sin. Irrefutable logic. What did she feel, she asked herself? A sense of the fullness of life, of adventure boldly dared. She had met one of the great crises of a woman's life, the crisis indeed. It must be so, since all the stories and movies and plays agreed on the point. The singular aspect of it was that she was conscious of no inner change. She was the same Pat Fentress, only a day older than yesterday. Being a woman, if this was it, was not so different from being a girl. And Mr. Scott, according to the conventions as she had absorbed them through the sensationalized and distorted lens to which her intellectual vision had become habituated, the lover should lose all respect for the unfortunate girl, this being the first symptom of the waning of his love. Well, it wasn't working that way with her lover. The few broken words of parting last night, the still passion of his letter told a different story. Possibly, reflected Pat, the people who set forth what purported to be life, on screen, stage, and the printed page, didn't know so much about it after all. Or possibly she and Carrie Scott were different from other people. She felt convinced that she was. From this she fell to speculating upon Scott's probable attitude toward the ingenious and comforting theory of conduct and responsibility which she had just formulated specially to fit the present crisis. Somehow it did not seem quite satisfactory in the illumination of his imagined view. She had thought of him always and rather mournfully as a non-religious, if not actually irreligious man, but it was disturbingly cast up from the depths of her mind that if Carrie Scott had a God, he would never try either to make cheap excuses to nor shift responsibility upon him. And suddenly, in that light, her exculpatory arguments seemed shallow and paltering. This uncomfortable consideration she thrust determinedly into the background and concentrated her thought upon her next meeting with Scott. All things considered, she was not, on the whole, sorry that he had gone away, assuming, of course, that he came back very soon. It gave her time to think, to figure things out free from the immediate glamour of his presence and the disturbing gladness of his return after the long disseverance. Did she really love him? She supposed she must. Yet there was still strong within her the impulse toward the companionship of youth which had inspired her petulant remonstrance to Dr. Bobbs over his opinion as to the desirable age for her husband. "I don't want to marry my grandfather." Would she marry Carrie Scott if he were free? Even now she doubted it. Not at once, anyway. She wanted her own freedom for a time yet. Freedom to enjoy life, to range, to pick and choose. But she had made her choice. Tradition would hold that she had taken an irrevocable step, committed herself. Tradition be damned. She didn't believe it. Would Carrie take that view? If, on his return, he should assume the proprietary attitude, evince a sense of possessiveness, Pat clenched her fists, but at once softened with the recollection of his sure comprehension, his unerring tact, his instinctive sense of her deeper emotions and reactions. So far as the immediate future went, he was not free to marry her, nor likely to be. That problem need not be faced now. Suppose later she fell in love and wanted to marry someone else. What would be her course then? Oh, well, let that take care of itself when it came. Meantime, she had something more immediate to look forward to in Carrie's return. She anticipated it with a mingling of trepidation, eagerness, warmth, and excited curiosity, the latter element being predominant. On the following morning she had another letter, and still a third on the day after. She quite gloried in his devotion. But she did not answer the letters. She rather wanted to, but found a difficulty in beginning. She preferred to plan out what she should say to him when they met again, and was in the act of building up quite a thrilling and eloquent statement of her feelings when the phone summoned her. "Pat," it was Dee's voice, queer and strained. "Can you come over at once?" "Yes, what's happened?" "Jim has been hurt." "Jim? How?" "Hit by a car." "Oh, Dee, is it bad?" "Yes, I think so. They're bringing him here." "I'll be right over." Pat made a dash for her runabout. When she reached the James house, there were 2 cars in the driveway, Dr. Osterhaus and a large touring car strange to her. There was blood on the steps which Pat mounted. "Is he killed?" she asked chokingly of a maid who was hurrying through the hall. "No'm," said the girl. "I don't think so." Then added in awe-stricken tones, "He was swearing something awful when they brung him in. The poor man." Pat followed her to the front room. Dr. Osterhaus's head was thrust out at her knock. "What can I do, Bobbs?" she asked. He nodded, approving the steadiness of her voice and control. "Locate a trained nurse and bring her here." I'll have one in 1/2 hour. How is he? Bad. Within the time prescribed, Pat was back with the nurse. She found Dee in the library waiting. The young wife's face was sallow, her eyes wide and shining and fixed. "Oh, Dee, don't," begged Pat. "You look so afraid." "I am afraid," was the monotoned reply. "Is he going to die?" "I don't know. That's what I'm afraid of." "I'm afraid he isn't." "Dee!" I know how it sounds. I don't care. When the word first came they said he was killed, I was glad." Pat stared at her aghast. "Why should I lie and pretend?" whispered the wife fiercely. "Why shouldn't I want to be free of him? You know how it is between us. I'm a marriage slave to a man who has no thought of anything but himself." She gulped and writhed in an access of strong physical nausea. Pat's strong hands fell upon her wrists. "Stop, Dee. You mustn't let yourself go that way. Tell me how it happened." "I don't know anything about it. The Marbury's car struck him down near the station." "Poor Jimmy." "Poor Jimmy? Poor me. Shall I tell you what happened last week?" "No, not now, Dee. I'm all right, I tell you, and I'm going to tell you. We fought it out to a finish. He wants to have children." "Children? After the agreement he broke?" "Well, I couldn't tell him the whole reason why I wouldn't, but I told him this, and it's true, too, as far as it goes. I said to him, 'Jim, if you've ever had one single thought for anybody in your life but yourself, I might feel different. But if there's anything in heredity, I'd as soon hand down idiocy to a child as to your strain. Now, if you want a separation, get it.' What do you think he said? 'Oh, no, my dear. That's heroics. I'm just about the same as other men. You don't get off so easily. As for selfishness, you didn't marry me in any spirit of altruism.'" "He had you there, Dee." "Yes, he had me there. Then he said, 'I'm going to hold you until you make good or break away yourself.' 'Then I'll break,' I said. 'I'll leave you.' He only smiled. 'You won't find it too easy,' he said. I could have killed him." "Are you really going to leave him?" asked Pat wide-eyed. "I was. Now," she jerked her hand upward, "how can I? What kind of a brute would I look?" "Perhaps he will die. Poor Jimmy." "If you say poor Jimmy once again, I'll scream at the top of my voice." A man in chauffeur's livery came down the stairs. He looked beseechingly at Dee. "I couldn't help it, Mrs. James," he gulped. "I never seen him until he grabbed the kid, and then I couldn't turn." "What kid?" asked Pat. "Didn't you hear how it happened?" "No, tell us." "I was coming down the road by the turn above the bridge when a little girl run out from the curb. Mr. James must have been right behind her. I honked and the kid stopped dead. I give the wheel a twist and the kid jumped right under the fender. I knew there wasn't no chance, but I jerked her again and felt her hit something hard, and the kid yelled once, and there was Mr. James under the wheels. He'd seen the little girl, and he made a dive for her and shoved her out from under just as I got him. It was the nerviest thing." The man's rough voice broke. "He must have knowed he didn't have a chance. A man's thinking little of himself to do that for a Dago kid he never seen before." Dee was leaning forward with a fixed stare and twitching lips which barely formed the words. "Did Jim do that?" "Yes'm, he sure did. He'd ought to get the Carnegie Medal for it." "And the little girl?" asked Pat, thrilled. "He saved her?" The man shook a doleful head. "He shoved her out from under my wheels, and she rolled right into a truck passing the other way." "Killed?" He nodded speechlessly. Dee burst into laughter. She laughed and laughed and laughed. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Flaming Youth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by MrsLSid. Flaming Youth by Samuel Hopkins Adams, Chapter 26. Never in all her career of coquetry had Pat devoted more careful planning than to her meeting with Carrie Scott should he return. At first sight of him, all her elaborate campaign was dissipated in consternation. "Mr. Scott!" she cried. He had come out from the city direct to Holiday Knoll and was standing in the library as she came downstairs to meet him, the morning light brilliant on his haggard face. At her exclamation, a wry smile twisted his lips. "Still that to you?" he asked. She moved toward him slowly, a little shyly, with fluttering hands outstretched, lips upturned, rather from the wish to comfort his manifest suffering than from any impulse of passion within herself. He drew her into his arms, bent over her, kissed her gently. She felt him tremble in her clasp. "What is it, Carrie?" she whispered. "You look too appalling." "I haven't slept very well." She drew back to survey him. "I don't believe you've slept at all," she pronounced. "Have you?" "It doesn't matter." "It does. You mustn't take it that way." His expression told her that her coolness amazed him, and then suddenly, by reflex from him, it amazed herself. It was so exactly the reverse of the programmed course of events as presented in the familiar media of her reading. She, the woman, the betrayed, was striving to comfort and reassure him, the man, the betrayer. "Did you expect that I should take it lightly, Pat?" "No, but—" "I love you," he said. No more than that, hardly above his breath. But it was as if he had pronounced the final word of passion, of yearning, of devotion, his full confession of the bond which is at once primal and eternal between man and woman. She dropped her head. The thick clusters of her hair rippled forward, almost concealing the eyes which she lifted, aslant, alight, mischievous, yet craving to his. "Do you?" she whispered. "Do you truly?" She nestled again close in his embrace. "And you, Pat?" he asked. "I don't know," she answered, troubled. "I've hardly been able to think since. I suppose I must, but—" "We have a great deal to say to each other," he began gravely, when she broke in. "I've had so much else to think about. Have you heard about poor Dee?" "Dee? No. What is it?" "It isn't exactly Dee. It's Jimmy. He was run over by a car 3 days ago." "Not killed?" "Almost. It's his back. Bob says they can save him, but it would be kinder to let him die. He'll never be anything but a helpless log." "Good heavens!" "Poor Dee. I must go over there." "We'll go over together. I'll tell you as we go." She ran to get her hat, returned at once, setting it in place on her mutinous hair, stood studying him for a moment through half-closed eyes, then leapt to him, flung her arms about his body, pressed her cheek to his, murmuring, "It's too flawless to have you back, Carrie." Outside, she said, "Dee was going to leave him." "No. For what earthly reason?" "I can't tell you. Yes, I can. I can tell you anything. Now." She flushed, but looked at him unflinchingly. "It's strange, isn't it?" "It's unutterably sweet," he said. "It's the companionship that is deeper and more lasting than any other association." "But there's always been that between us," she mused. "Only it's different now. I don't quite understand. There's so much I don't understand, Carrie dear. But I know that I want to tell you. I don't believe Dee would mind." She repeated Dee's bitter protest over James's breach of faith, her refusal to accept maternity, her recent resolution to quit her husband at whatever cost of scandal. "And now she can't," she concluded. "You mean she won't?" "Yes, Dee's a good sport. She'll stick to a man when he's down. The worst of it is she told him why she wouldn't have a baby of his, because he was just a bunch of pure selfishness. And then he goes and pulls a real hero stunt and deliberately throws his life away for a Dago brat, and doesn't save the darn thing anyway, concluded Pat, her lips quivering. Where does that leave Dee? Was it what Dee said that drove him to do it? No, it was too quick for that. He did it instinctively. It must have been in him all the while to do the big, self-sacrificing thing when it was put up to him, like the men on the Titanic that everybody thought were wasters. That's what makes it so rotten for Dee. She thinks she's misjudged him all the time. I believe she'd give her life now to have a child for him. Well, queried Scott. Pat shook a mournful head. No, never. Not a chance. Haven't I told you? He'll live in a plaster cast the rest of his life if he does live. I wouldn't. I've had a hell of a time with Dee, Carrie. Poor darling. Do you think Dee will want to see me? Yes, I'm sure she will. Perhaps not today. Has this really turned her to James again, Pat? Has it made her really love him, you mean? How could she? Women aren't that way. But all she can think of now is her remorse. He paced along beside her in deep thought for a time before he said, Was there any other reason for her leaving him? The other man? She gave him a quick look. I suppose that had something to do with it. Carrie, was it a rotten trick for Dee to marry Jimmy? I'm afraid it was, rather. Poor child, she's paying for it. Do women always pay for it? No, sometimes the men do. You know Dee's man, don't you? Yes. Do you know where he is now? Not at this moment, but I know he is intending to come back here in a few days. To see Dee? I'm afraid so. He mustn't. No, he mustn't. Can't you stop him? If I can reach him. Carrie, you must stop him. Is she still in love with him? Terribly. I'll do my best. At the James house they found Dr. Osterhout. Pat went up to Dee after bidding Carrie come to the knoll directly after dinner. Going out with a physician, he asked how serious James's case really was. As serious as it could possibly be, was the grim reply. He'll live. Then Pat was right. He'll never be any better? Not much. A paralytic, with a good deal of suffering. Can't you help him die? Muttered Scott. The medical man turned an uncompromising look upon the other. When I acquire the wisdom of deity, then I'll assume the prerogatives of deity. Not before. It's a merciless attitude. In a case like this, the physician cut him short. The man's life may be valuable to others, if not to himself. And suppose after I'd killed him, as you so casually suggest, the other's gesture of protest did not serve to stop him, and some new operation was discovered that would restore this kind of case. Where should I stand with myself? Is that likely? It's most unlikely, but it's possible. In any case, we doctors do not kill. You don't give a thought to Dee. A ripple of pain twisted the harsh features. I'm trying not to. My business is with my patient. Does he know? Yes. He wormed the truth out of me. He wants Dee to get a separation. A separation? I don't understand. What is his idea? To relieve her from being tied to a corpse, as he says. He's taken to thinking of others besides himself at this late date, has T. Jamison James. A close look at death sometimes works these miracles. Trying to make his peace with heaven? No. He's honest in this, just as he has always been in his selfishness. He's thinking only of Dee. Does he really care for her, Osterhout? I think he'd die without her. Isn't there a good chance of his dying anyway? Nothing to bank on. What does Dee say to the separation idea? Won't listen. Just turns away and stops her ears. More than ever convinced that Wollaston must be kept away from Dorisdale at all costs, Scott put in the hours between his talk with Osterhout and his appointment with Pat, striving to locate the Englishman on the long-distance telephone, but without success. Upon his arrival at the knoll, Scott found only Ralph Fentress in possession. "Pat is just starting back from Dee's," said the ostensible head of the Fentress household after a hearty greeting. "She telephoned. Pretty rough on Dee, this, isn't it?" "She's standing up under it like the sport she is," said Scott. They chatted of local matters, Fentress being patently restless. At the sound of Pat's step on the threshold, he said with relief, "Oh, you'll excuse me, Carrie. I've got a business engagement downtown." The visitor repressed a smile. So Ralph Fentress's evening business engagements remained a constant quantity. A casual sort of father. Had he been less casual, had Pat been less unprotected? A throb of remorse and self-contempt sickened Scott to the core of his heart. How could he have let himself be so swept away? Pat stood before him in the doorway, and at once his bitter self-accusation sank into nothingness before the delight of her victorious charm. How could he have helped being carried away, loving her as he did? She tossed her hat on the table, her gloves at him and herself into the armchair. "Now we can talk," said she. "You begin." At their morning meeting, it had seemed to him that the indeterminate and hovering tragedy of the James household had aged and sobered Pat, given more of the womanly to her elfin fascination. Now she seemed again all gamine, provocative, elusive, challenging. He stood looking down at her gravely. "Owl face," she mocked, protruding the tip of her red tongue. "Pat, will you marry me?" The smile died from her eyes and lips. "How could we? You're married." "I'll get free." "How can you?" "I'd rather not tell you." "You've got to tell me," she retorted imperiously. "Yes," he admitted. "I've got to if you insist. You've the right to know." She softened. "Have I? Tell me then." "I have evidence." He spoke with an effort. "Against your wife?" "Yes." "Why haven't you used it before?" "I haven't wanted to, and I considered that it would not be entirely honorable." "If it wasn't honorable before, how is it now?" demanded the keen Pat. "I don't know that it is," he muttered. "But there's another question of honor now, a paramount question between you and me." "Tell me why it wouldn't be honorable to use your evidence," persisted Pat, ignoring the other issue. "You're making it very hard. It's true that she, my wife, has been unfaithful, but that was after we had been long separated in everything but the formalities, and morally I was in no position to blame her." "You'd been untrue to her?" "Yes." "With another woman? Were you very much in love with her, Carrie, the other woman?" she asked wistfully. For a moment he hesitated, a moment too long, for a flash of hateful intuition shot through Pat's quick brain. "There was more than one. There may have been a dozen. Oh, I think you're revolting." "I'm not going to lie to you, Pat. I regarded myself as free of all responsibility to her." "You're free of all responsibility to me," she choked. "Don't think that I want—" "No, I am bound to you by the strongest tie I have ever known. I love you." "You've loved 100 other women," charged Pat, savagely reveling in her exaggeration. "I've loved no one as I love you." Despite the banality of the words, there was in his speech a quiet force that calmed and convinced her. "Not so that I ever wished to be free and marry." "Of course," she said loftily. "There's no reason why I should be jealous of your past." "It is your future that I have been jealous of always," he replied. "That is 1,000 times harder to bear, and now I am asking you to give it to me." "You do a dishonorable thing, a thing you consider dishonorable, to be free?" she asked. "To marry you," he said doggedly. "Yes, there's nothing I'd stop at." She gave her little delighted crow. "I believe you wouldn't. But I'm not going to let you." "You can't prevent me." "I wouldn't marry you if you did." His brows took on their ironic lift. That is heroics, Pat, motion picture heroics. To save the other woman. Pat pouted. It's misplaced nobility, my dear. She isn't entitled to it. She doesn't care for me. You do. Not enough to marry you, though. Not enough to be sure. It's all so puzzling, Carrie. Her deep, soft voice shook. I don't understand myself, but I'm just not sure. Is that terrible of me, dear, not to want to marry you? Don't you love me, Pat? He asked, incredulous of the doubt itself. I suppose I do, now. If only it would last like this. But it can't go on like this, he cried hoarsely. Why can't it? She murmured protestingly. The eternal feminine within her, eternally static, eternally conservative, eternally fatalistic where its own interests are concerned, was asserting itself. Better the thing as it is, however precarious, than a step in the dark. Change to a woman's apprehension is a challenge to the unknown. Surely you must know, surely you must realize the constant risk, the constant danger. Of being found out? I'm not afraid for myself. You know, Carrie dear, I never can quite believe in danger until it comes. I suppose I ought to. I suppose I ought to feel different in lots of ways. Yet I don't feel different. Not really. Tell me why, Carrie. He bent and kissed the sweet, troubled eyes, the soft, questioning lips. My darling, he said brokenly. My little Pat. I wish to God I'd never come back. No, don't wish that. I'm glad you came anyway. It's been very dull without you, Carrie, she added with childish plaintiveness. Then why... Don't ask me any more whys tonight, please. My head's so tired with thinking. Throw open the windows, wide. I want to breathe the spring. He obeyed. The soft, odor-drenched, earthy wind flowed in, surrounded them, englamored them, swept them into each other's arms. I'm so tired, Carrie dear, murmured Pat. So tired. Just hold me close. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of Flaming Youth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by MrsLSid. Flaming Youth by Samuel Hopkins Adams, Chapter 27. The night air was warm, moist, astir with vernal growth. The trees whispered tender secrets to each other. Flowers were being born in the grasses. Clouds formed a light coverlet above an earth too fecund of dreams to sleep soundly. Dee emerged from the side door of the James house and moved down the cedar path, soft as a wraith. The still mansion oppressed her. For 2 weeks she had hardly stirred beyond earshot of her husband's petulant, pathetic need of her. Her young blood craved air, the expanses, the sense of space and quiet. Definite verdict had been pronounced that afternoon upon T. Jamieson James by Dr. Osterhout after a careful resume of the case with the consulting surgeon. He'll last indefinitely, as long, one might say, as he has the will to live. 5 years, 10, 20 if he can stand it. Much depends on you, Dee. Will he get better? Osterhout moved uneasily. Better? Stronger, a little. Not really better. A wheelchair existence at best. I can't conceive of it for Jim. He'll adjust himself to it after a fashion. People do. But he'll be difficult, damn difficult. Have you thought any more of his offer to release you? No, and I won't think of it. I wouldn't have supposed you would, being you. You're a good sort, Dee, and a good sport. He rubbed his forehead with a stubby forefinger. As for your own status, you want me to be frank, don't you? Yes, Bobs. It's a life of, well, practical practical widowhood for you. You understand. Yes, she had understood, and with an influx of relief.
Her loyalty would keep her beside her husband, helpless, whereas she would have left him had he been his normal, self-centered, self-sufficient self. More, she would now gladly have forgiven him the breach of their private marriage agreement, have accepted the full regimen and responsibility of wifehood could she have borne him the child he wished, the child which might have brought an enduring and saving interest into his ruined life. But from that hateful duty she was absolved, the more reason for standing by him through his ordeal. At worst, she was now free to be faithful in thought and spirit to the man to whom, had he been husband or lover to her, she could have given her all in glorious surrender. He stepped from the shadow of a cedar and stood before her. "Dee!" "Stanley!" Her hands flew to her breast. "How long have you been here?" "Hours. Since dark." "Why didn't you send word?" "Would it have been safe to write?" "Quite, now." "How now?" "Don't you know? Haven't you seen Carrie Scott?" "Not since I left Baltimore. I came the first moment that I could after making arrangements. Our arrangements." They had stood apart, but now he reached forward, took her hands, crushed them to his cheek. At his touch she flamed and trembled. "When can you come with me, Dee?" "With you? Where?" "To England. The divorce can be arranged, and our marriage follow. You can trust me." "Oh, yes, I can trust you," she answered dully. "Then when?" "I can't go with you, Stanley." "Can't?" he repeated incredulously. "When I can feel your pulse leap when I touch your hand, when—" "I love you with every breath I take," she cried low and passionately. She snatched her hands from his grip, wreathed them back of his head, drew his lips down upon hers. "I've never dreamed what it could be to love as I love you." "Come with me," he said. The wife looked about her like a trapped creature. "I've got to make him understand," she muttered to herself in travail of spirit. "I've got to make him see and help me." "Stanley," she pleaded, "be kind to me and don't stop me till I've finished telling you what I've got to tell." She related the accident and its sequel in few and simple words. For a time of pulse beats Wollaston was silent, then, "Poor devil," he murmured. "Poor, poor devil." "So you see, dear love—" "I see nothing but that we belong together. You can't deny that kiss and what it means. You can't let me go back alone, Dee. Shall I stay?" "Oh, no, no, I couldn't bear it." "Then you must come with me, now, tonight." "For God's sake, Stanley, don't! Don't kiss me!" She was fighting for strength, for breath. "Don't make me—" "Dee! Dee! Where are you?" The petulant, flattened voice of helplessness came like a stab of pain through the night. A light, tenuous and sharp, flashed out from the wrecked man's window. Its ray touched the cedar overshadowing them. Dee answered at once. "I'm coming, Jim. Just a moment." "Goodbye, Stanley." He gathered her into a slow, overmastering pressure of body to body, face to face. "Dee, I love you. I want you." "I know. God, how I know." "As you love and want me. What does anything else matter?" "Oh, love, don't make it so bitter hard for me. I can't leave him. He needs me so. I can't. Dee, the pain has come back. Where are you?" "Coming, Jim, dear." She turned away from Wollaston without another look, heard him thrashing through the brushy growth like a man blinded, felt her knees sag and give way. She toppled slowly forward and lay, face down upon the earth that gives life, that gives courage, that gives endurance to bear the deadliest hurt, her fingers tearing in agony at the young grasses. Presently she heaved herself up and went into the house. Her mouth was firm, her eyes tearless. A good sort. A good sport. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Flaming Youth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer,
please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by MrsLSid. Flaming Youth by Samuel Hopkins Adams, Chapter 28. For 2 weeks, Pat and Scott lived in a paradise of constant dangers and passionate adventure. Fate played into their hands. James, as he recovered a little strength, developed a strong inclination for Scott's society, and insisted that he remain at their house as guest. The two men played chess and bezique. To Dee, in her time of ordeal and sacrifice, it was a relief without which she must have broken to have the invalid taken off her hands for a good part of every day. Twice daily Pat came over from the knoll, often staying to luncheon on her morning visit and returning directly after dinner to make a fourth hand at bridge whenever James was in fit condition to play. As a matter of course, Scott took her home and ostensibly left her while he went for a long walk alone before returning to the James place. In reality, those hours were spent with Pat in her conservatory. "When are you going to get tired of me?" she asked pertly, one gold-studded night of stars and soft winds as they sat together at the open window of the secluded room. She was perched on the arm of his chair, her hand overhanging the back to touch the short curls at his temple. He drew her palm downward and spoke with his lips lightly pressed upon it. "When that planet yonder tumbles down out of the sky into your lap." "But you ought to, you know. They always do." "Still obsessed by the movies," he interpreted playfully. "This is the real world we're living in." "Sometimes I wonder if it is. It doesn't seem too real." "You're a phantasm yourself," said he jealously. "I never quite grasp and hold you." "Yet I belong to you, don't I? Or is that just a silly form of words that hasn't any real meaning?" "It's a phrase. You belong to yourself. You always will. There's that quality of the eternally unattainable, the eternally virginal about you." "Is there? I love to have you say that. Do you truly think it, Carrie?" "In the depths of my heart, where you live." "But it wouldn't be so if we were married." "It would always be so, my darling." Ever keenly interested in her own character and its reflex upon others, she took this under thoughtful consideration. "I've never felt that I could really belong to anybody, not even to you. If I could think it, then perhaps I'd want to marry you. Does that mean that I don't love you, Carrie, or what?" "Not as I love you," he replied with gloomy patience. "It means that I've got to wait." "Here?" she flashed at him with her bewildering smile. "But you've been threatening to go away again." "I ought to," he groaned. "I just haven't the willpower. It would be like giving up hope to leave you now." "Poor darling." But there was a touch of mockery in her pity. "If it weren't so terribly dangerous for you." Her proud little head went up. "I told you long ago that I always did what I wanted. If I take a chance, I'm willing to pay for it. I'm not afraid." "Because you've never suffered. You've never had to take punishment." "Have you?" "I'm taking it now in the thought of our separation." "Pat, for God's sake, let me get free, if it is only to be ready, in case—" "No, no, no," she denied vehemently. "I won't be captured, compelled. You can go if you want to, as soon as you want to." "Pat!" "Yes, I know." Her lips brushed his cheek in sweet contrition. "That was mean of me. But I just don't want to marry you." She spaced the words with rhythmic deliberation. "I don't want to marry anybody, and have a lot of kids, and look like Con does now. She waddles." "Carrie, were you her lover?" she demanded abruptly. "No." "I couldn't bear it if you had been. But you'd say that anyway, wouldn't you? Even to me?" "It's quite true. I never was." "If anyone asked you that about me, you'd swear by all your gods you weren't, wouldn't you?" "Yes." "You'd lie about it. I hate to think of your lying. I wonder whether I would if it was put up to me, or whether I'd admit that we are lovers."
She brooded darkly for a moment over the word. I didn't mean to be, you know, she added naively. Whatever fault there is was mine, he claimed hoarsely. If there is any just God. She slipped her fingers over his lips, cutting him short. Don't, Carrie. Don't say if. Of course there is. Then he will hold me responsible, not you. She rose, giving her shoulders the quaint sliding wriggle with which she was wont to slough off, symbolically, problems too troublesome for solution. Oh, if things are going to happen, they happen, she muttered. That's the fate part of it. But I do suppose we can't go on forever. We'll crash some way. Does anyone suspect? Dee? I don't think so. She's got troubles enough of her own these days. If it's anyone, it's Con. She's been asking some snoopy kind of questions. What questions? Oh, I don't know. I told her to go to the devil, that I was over 12, and she told me I'd better remember particularly that I was. I don't like that, said he. Oh, well, I don't like it much myself, but what can she do? Talk. Not outside the family. Con isn't that kind. She might tell Fred. That would be a pleasant complication, he observed grimly. There will be more and more complications all the time, she fretted. If only you weren't married. But I thought, he began eagerly. Then there wouldn't be any kick. We could be supposed to be engaged. I suppose we would be engaged, she added brightly, as if a new thought had struck her. Being engaged implies being married eventually, he pointed out. Not these days, she retorted. It doesn't hold you up for anything, and we could snap out of it when we got good and ready. Only, this isn't the kind of thing you can snap out of, is it? A cloud darkened the vivacity of her face. We're terrible boobs, Carrie. Let's stop it. That's wholly in your hands, dear love. Yes, she said discontentedly. You've always put everything up to me, let me go my own way. That's why I've gone so far. I wonder if you knew that was the way to get me. You're so damn clever. Like what's his name? Mephistoph? No, Machiavelli, wasn't it? She dropped to the floor in front of him, clasped her hands over his knee, turned upward a shadowy and bewitching face, speaking in a lowered voice. Listen, dear. Next week I'm going back to Philadelphia to finish out my visit with Sissy. But I won't go to Sissy's, not till the next day. We'll have that time together. That will be our goodbye. And then you must go away. If you wish it so, he assented steadily. I don't wish it so. But it's got to come sometime. You say so yourself. Yes, it's got to come sometime. Unless... I know the unless. I don't say I'll never send for you to come back. I might. I'll never come back except with my freedom. And if you send for me, it must be for good and all. I wish I could, Carrie. I wish I were sure, she said wistfully. She jumped to her feet. Tell me good night, she commanded, holding out her arms. And you're to come early tomorrow and take me for a long walk. Overnight luck, which had so befriended the lovers, turned against them. They returned from their morning's tramp, weary but elate with the vigor of strong sunshine and woodland air. Pat, her glorious eyes welling light, paused by the open library window. Is there anything in the world that we haven't talked to a finish today, Carrie? She demanded, laughing. Nothing, dearest. Yet tomorrow we'll have just as much to talk about as if we'd never spoken a word to each other. It's rather wonderful, isn't it? What makes us that way? Companionship, the rarest thing in life or love. She swung herself in by the window. Come on, companion, she invited. As he followed, she detached a few sprays from the huge cluster of wild purple violets at her belt and set them in his coat. Decoration of companionship, she said. And, she stretched up and kissed his lips, reward for a happy morning. There was a stifled exclamation. Constance rose from the depths of the big armchair facing away from them and confronted the pair. Pat burst into harsh laughter. "Trapped!" she exclaimed. Constance's face, with its strained, expectant, apprehensive expression of imminent motherhood, was white. "Pat, I think you'd better leave me with Mr. Scott," she said. "I don't," snapped Pat. "If you've got anything to say, say it." Her eyes burned somberly, angrily. She was furious with her sister for having surprised her. A puzzled, helpless look came over Constance's face. "I wouldn't have believed," she began lamentably. "How long has this been going on?" "None of your business," returned Pat coolly. "It will be Father's business. I shall phone him now." "Wait, Connie," put in Scott with quiet authoritativeness. "Wouldn't it be as well to consider consequences before making more trouble than can perhaps be undone?" "You're afraid, are you? Well, you can run." "I shall stay here, if you phone, until Mr. Fentress comes." Constance swayed, irresolute, uncertain on her feet. "How far has this gone?" she muttered. Scott rallied his defenses. "You're not to think that this is just a casual, cheap flirtation," he said. "If I could make you understand how deeply and honestly I love Pat." "Honestly?" echoed Constance with scorn. "I won't split words with you, and for myself I've no excuses to make. I ought to have held myself better in hand. But as for this sort of thing, my kissing Pat, it's the first time, and it will be—" "Oh, piffle!" Pat's reckless voice broke in. "Tell her the truth, Carrie." Constance looked from one to the other. Her lips quivered, curled down at the corners like a grieved baby's. She began to sob in short, quick, strangled catches of the breath. Suddenly a dreadful look convulsed her face. She pressed her hands down upon her abdomen. "Oh!" she cried. The pain! Pat, Scott jumped to catch her, barely in time to break the fall. He eased her into the chair. Pat was beside him instantly. "Phone for Bob's, quick! Tell him to get Dr. Corsi. No, you go for Dr. Corsi, it'll save time. Second house around the corner. Tell him to bring everything, all his instruments and a nurse. Don't come back. I'll write you." As he hurried to the door, he heard a shriek, then Pat's strong, soothing voice. "All right, Con, old girl. The doctor'll be here in 5 minutes." Such was their parting, one of life's sardonic emendations to the plots and plans of lovers. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of Flaming Youth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by MrsLSid. Flaming Youth by Samuel Hopkins Adams, Chapter 29. "Some kind of internal explosion has taken place in our little family, dear one," wrote Robert Osterhout to his dead love, "and is still taking place, which is rather a deliberate method for an explosion. They are keeping me out of it. Even Pat will not confide in me. Therefore I infer that it is not so much her trouble as the others. Con's baby is now 6 months old. She had a bad time of it, but the son is a lusty creature. About the time of his birth there was a quarrel between Con and Pat, not wholly made up yet. But while Con was so ill, Pat stood by, a tower of strength. From the way in which she gave up everything to look after Con and her household, I was almost ready to suspect a touch of remorse. But what about? There was the contemporaneous phenomenon of Carrie Scott going away so abruptly, quite without explanation. I ask myself whether it is possible that the old fire flamed up between Con and him, and Pat was in some way involved. A tangled skein. Dee troubles me too. She has grown so subdued and inert. Her devotion to James would explain it to a casual observer. It isn't enough for me. There is something else. She withdraws from me too, but she has always given me less of her confidence than the others. It is a sort of shyness, and at times it hurts.
I so long to help her, but you can't help another person who lives in a fourth dimension by herself. Pat is back in the rush and whirl of things, going faster than ever, but she does not seem to be getting as much fun out of it as of old. She is as little comprehensible as ever. To Pat herself, her mental processes were difficult of comprehension. It was now 6 months since she and Carrie Scott had so strangely and inconsequentially parted, and he had gone back to Europe. On the whole, she did very well without him, but that there was a gap she could not deny to herself. Rather uncompromisingly what she was, she filled it with other masculine interests. Rather to her surprise, she did not find herself specially tempted to venture upon forbidden ground with any other man. The barriers once down, she had supposed that self-control would be more difficult. But curiosity is an important part of sex attraction to the untried, and her curiosity was appeased. Perhaps, too, Scott had been right in imputing to her an instinctive quality of virginity, constantly at war against but not incompatible with her passionate temperament. Certainly the substitute interest seemed dull and insufficient as compared with her association with Scott. At times she missed intolerably that unique understanding and companionship which he had given her, and these times became more instead of less frequent as the weeks lengthened out, which was both unexpected and perturbing. She was seriously annoyed with him, too, because he had respected religiously her injunction against writing, and when, 3 months after his departure, she herself had written, lifting the embargo, he had returned after a long silence a single sentence. "When you send for me, I will come, but you must be ready to accept all and give all." Choosing to interpret this as an attempt to bully her, she was properly wrathful. By way of logical reprisal, though how it was to affect him she would have found it difficult to say, she stepped on the gas, as she would have put it, and speeded up an already sufficient pace. Local eruptions followed. "All the old cats are squalling their heads off at me," she complained to Osterhout. "What would you expect?" said the philosophical doctor. "Of course you'd take that side," retorted the aggrieved Pat. "Why should they?" "For one item, the broken Vandergrift-Mercer engagement." "I didn't do it," disclaimed Pat, but she dimpled a little. "You're popularly credited with having a hand in it, not to say a face." "Don't be coarse, Bobs. What right had Bess Vandergrift to be sticking her blotchy face between the curtains? What right had you to be kissing Bess's best young feller?" "Liar yourselves, Bobs. I didn't kiss him. He kissed me." "It's a fine distinction. Maybe a shade too fine for Bess." "I haven't kissed a man," declared Pat virtuously. "That is to say, really kissed, well, never mind that," with hasty but belated discretion. "I didn't want Harry to kiss me. True woolly, Bobs. Though I did suspect that he might get interesting and try. She's a sob, anyway." "Then there's Stanley Johnston." "All off. Tackles too hard," said Pat. "And Mark Denby. You keep him rushing back and forth between here and Baltimore like a demented drummer." "Oh, Mark's like the pig that forgot he was educated. He doesn't count." "Who does count at the present moment?" "Nobody. That's the big trouble," said Pat fretfully. "They none of 'em give me any thrill. I'm bored, Bobs." "Pose of youth," opined Bobs. Herein he was wrong. Pat really was bored, though she would not admit to herself the reason, deep and effective in the background of her willful soul. Life was flat, stale, tasteless. Men were either unenterprising guinea pigs or bellowing rhinoceroses. Women were cats. She loathed the tame and monotonous world. It was boredom, combined with the provocative accidental discovery, that led her to the reckless adventure of the Washington Heights flat in Edna Carroll. In an earlier age, the Fentress family would have referred to Edna Carroll with hushed voices, if at all, as that woman. In this enlightened and tolerant time, she was humorously characterized by the three girls as Ralph's Flossie. Little was known of her. She lived somewhere outside the social pale, and Fentress's liaison with her had endured for many years. Constance was sure that she was of the flamboyant, roistering chorus girl type. Dee inclined to the soft and babyish siren. Pat speculated rangingly, and had more than once endeavored to pump Osterhout, with notable lack of success. From some unlocatable purlieu of gossip had issued the rumor that Ralph Fentress was going to marry her, perhaps had already done so secretly. Constance was outraged. Dee was cynically amused, but skeptical. Pat was hotly excited. Entering the city by one of the upper ferries one day in search of a dressmaker's assistant, recreant in the matter of a dinner gown, the youngest daughter was startled to see her father's car drawn up opposite a pleasant-looking apartment house on a quiet side street. At 3:30 in the afternoon. The truth leapt to her mind. Profusely blooming flowers made beautiful the third-floor window ledge. There, Pat decided, was the nest of the bird. Fearing that her father might emerge and find her, she hastened away. On the following morning, full of delightful tremors and keen anticipations, for this would be something indeed to tell the girls, she returned and pressed the third button in the entry. The light click of the release almost sent her scuttling out, but she gathered her resolution, composed a demure face for herself, and mounted the stairs. In the top hallway stood a slim, tailor-made woman with glasses pushed up on her forehead. Pat at once made up her mind that she was attractive in an alert, bird-like way. "Whom are you looking for?" asked the woman pleasantly. Pat liked her voice. "Does Mrs. Fentress live here?" "Who?" said the woman in a tone which made Pat regret that she had chosen that particular form of opening. Pat faltered out the enquiry again, not knowing what else to do. The other's brown and dancing eyes grew formidably cold. "Why do you ask for Mrs. Fentress?" "I thought this was where she lived." "There is no Mrs. Fentress here." "Perhaps I've got the wrong apartment." "No, I think you have the right one. Who are you?" Entire frankness appeared to the intruder the method of sense and safety. "I'm Pat. Patricia Fentress." "I thought so. By what right do you come here?" Two tiny spots of reddish flame shone in the wine-dark eyes. Pat decided that she was very attractive. "Please don't be angry with me." "You're hardly here as an emissary of the family, I suppose?" "No, I just came." "In that case, hadn't you better just go again?" "If you tell me to," said Pat, downcast and humble. The other hesitated. "I can't conceive what you mean by this visit," she said with severity, into which, however, had crept a mitigating quality. "Was it just vulgar curiosity?" Pat nodded so vigorously that her hair flicked forward about her face like wind-whipped silk ribbons. "You're frank, at any rate. I like that." Abruptly she stepped back. "As you're here, come in." Pat obeyed. "You're awfully good to let me." "Am I? That remains to be seen." She led the way to an airy, daintily furnished front room, a conspicuous feature of which was a big armchair with a drawing board across the arms. "What's that?" asked Pat with lively curiosity. "My work." "Oh, are you an artist?" "Of a sort. I make fashion drawings." "How diverting!" Pat was recovering herself. "Can't you go on working while we talk?" "Are we going to talk?" The corners of the firm mouth crinkled up, a dimple affirmed its existence, the brown eyes twinkled, and Pat incontinently and most improperly fell in love with her hostess. "I think you're too delightful." "I can be quite otherwise on occasion, to impertinent people." "Don't scare me again," begged Pat. "I won't be impertinent, though I want to be terribly." "As that is what you came for, perhaps you'd better be." Why did you ask for Mrs. Fentress?
Isn't that what you're called?
Certainly not. An inspiration struck Pat. We heard that you'd married Dad. The hostess replaced her glasses, seated herself, and began to ink in a sketch. Did you?
Is it true?
No, we are not married. No good, that line. A chilling thought followed.
He isn't likely to be coming here, is he?
Why? Are you afraid of being caught?
I can't think of anything more poisonous.
Don't be alarmed. He couldn't get in if he did come. Pat searched her mind for movie evidence.
Hasn't he got a key?
No. Why not be honest and ask directly what's in your mind?
I don't know how, confessed the visitor.
For a singularly forward young person, you don't get on very fast. How old are you?
19, but I know everything about everything.
If you don't, it isn't for lack of enterprise, was the grim reply. And what you don't know, you suspect. In this case, your suspicions are quite correct. But it doesn't follow that your father comes and goes at will here, in my place. There was the slightest emphasis on the possessive.
Oh, I thought they always had a key and
paid the rent and filled the place with luxury and orchids, cigarettes and champagne. You've been reading cheap novels. The rotten-minded little fiction writers don't know everything. They don't know anything about women. Pat leaned forward.
Are you going to marry Dad?
The artist's face hardened. You were sent here to find that out? Well, then I am.
I'm glad,
said Pat simply and sincerely. The older woman took off her glasses, rose, walked across to the lounge where Pat was seated, and set her delicate hands on the girl's shoulders, staring into her face with an inscrutable expression. Why do you say that?
Because it's true. I'm crazy about you already.
The other sat down limply. What kind of a person are you?
An honest one.
Then I'll be too. I'm not going to marry Ralph. I can't. I've got a husband. He's no good. I haven't lived with him for years. I had a devil of a life. I was going to kill myself when I met Ralph.
Were you so poor? Asked Pat sympathetically.
Poor? Do you think it was a question of money with me that took me to Ralph? Retorted the other with slow anger.
No, I don't know why I said that. But you're so young.
So is he, was the defiant reply. He's eternally young. That's what I love in him. I loved him the first time I ever saw him, and I've never stopped. But if you've come here looking for a common kept woman—
I haven't. Oh, I haven't,
broke in Pat, squirming. Anyway, you know all about me now. All except my name, Edna Carroll. What are you going to tell your family?
Not a word.
Aren't you? You're a strange little witch. Do you like me a little? Asked Pat, slant-eyed and demure. Yes, I do. You're very like Ralph in some ways.
Then may I come again?
No.
Why not?
I should have thought you might understand without my drawing you a diagram.
Conventional stuff, scoffed the girl.
How do you get that way? I'm coming anyway, Edna. Edna Carroll laughed uncertainly. I'm insane to let you. But I'd love to have you. What would your father think?
He's not going to think at all. We won't give him the chance. Will you ask me to your parties?
How do you know I give parties?
You're the kind that always draws people around them.
Besides, added the shrewd Pat, there's a violin and a clarinet on the piano. I don't suppose you play them all. And I'm mad about music. Inheritance, murmured Edna softly.
She let her darkling glance rest on the piano bench where Ralph Fentress had so often sat to make his music. "Very well. I'll ask you sometime." She was as good as her word. It was there that Pat met Leo Stanek. End of chapter 29.
Chapter 30 of Flaming Youth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by MrsLSid. Flaming Youth by Samuel Hopkins Adams, Chapter 30. The episode between Leo Stanek and Patricia Fentress was headlong as a torrent. She heard him before she saw him, heard rather his violin, expression and interpretation of his innermost self. The raucous sweetness of his tone, which he overemphasizes and sentimentalizes, and which is the cardinal defect of his striking and uneven style, floated out to her as she stood, astonished, in the exterior hallway of Edna Carroll's flat. When it died into silence, she supposed that the number was over, and entered just as he was resuming. Her first impression was of a plump, sallow, carelessly dressed youth with hair almost as shaggy as her own, and the most wildly luminous eyes she had ever looked into, who turned upon her with an infuriated regard, and at once pointedly dropped his bow. His savage regard followed her while she crossed the room to speak to her hostess. This was no way to treat high-spirited Pat. Quite deliberately she took off gloves and wrap, handed them to the nearest young man, and remarked to the violinist, "It's very nice of you to wait. I'm quite fixed now, thank you." A vicious snort was the only response. The accompanist, who had trailed along a bar or two before appreciating the interruption, took up his part, and the melody again filled the air. In spite of her exasperated feelings, Pat recognized the power and distinction of the performance. Nevertheless, she refrained from joining in the applause which followed the final note. At once the musician crossed to her, which was exactly what she had intended. "You don't like music," he accused, glowering. "I love it," retorted Pat. "Then you don't like my music." "Better than your manners." "I care nothing for manners. I am not a society puppet." "If you were, perhaps you would have waited to be presented." "I am Leo Stanek," said he impressively. If not unduly impressed, Pat was at least interested. She remembered the name from having heard Carrie Scott speak of a youthful violinist named Stanek, who had appeared at a Red Cross concert the year before, and for whom he had predicted a great career, if he can get over his cubbish egotism and self-satisfaction. "I've heard of you," she remarked. "The whole world will hear of me presently," he replied positively. "Where did you hear?" "From a friend of mine, Carrie Scott." Stanek searched his memory. "I never heard of him. An amateur?" "Yes." "Amateurs don't count," was his superb pronouncement. "Any friend of mine counts," said Pat coldly, and turned her back upon him. He flounced away exactly like a disgruntled schoolgirl. "Don't mind Leo, Pat," said her hostess, coming over to her with a smile of amusement. "He's a spoiled child, almost as much spoiled as you are." "I don't mind him," returned the girl equably, but inside she was tingling with the sense of combat and of the man's intense and salient personality. She was sure that he would come back to her. Late in the evening he did, with a manifest effect of its being against his judgment and intention, which delighted her mischievous soul. Most of the others had left. "They tell me you sing, Miss Fentress," he began abruptly. "A little," replied Pat, who had been devoting what she regarded as hard and grinding work to her music for a 6-month. "Ragtime, I suppose?" contemptuously. "And others." "Know the Chanson de Florian?" "Of course." "Well, it's light sort of trash, but it has a melody. I've written my own obligato to it. If you like, I'll play it with you." "I don't like it all, thank you." "You owe me something for spoiling my andante when you came in." I played wretchedly after that. You did something to me. I was too conscious of you to get back into the music. Won't you sing for me?" His manner was quite amenable now. His splendid eyes held and made appeal to her. "But I'm an amateur," she answered, still obdurate. "And amateurs don't count." "It isn't every amateur I'd ask. Come on." He caught up his violin. "Ready, Carlos?" he said to the accompanist. Pat gave her little reckless laugh. "Oh, very well," she sang. It seemed to her that she was in exceptionally good voice, inspired and upheld by the golden stream of counter-melody which surged from the violin. At the close, he looked at her intently and in silence. "Well?" queried Pat, thrilling with expectancy of merited praise. "You sing rottenly," he replied with entire seriousness. "Thank you." Pat's somber eyes smarted with tears of mortification. "But you have a voice. Some of the notes, pure music. Your method? Horrible. You should practice." "I've been practicing. A terrible lot." "Pfft! Fiddle-faddling. You amateurs don't know what work is." "Do you think my voice is worth working with?" "Perhaps. It has beauty. You are beautiful yourself. Where do you live?" Pat laughed. "What's the big idea, Mr. Stenack?" "I will take you home when you go. I wish to talk to you." "I'm not going home. I'm staying with friends downtown." "Then I will take you there. May I?" "Yes, if you'll play once more for me first." Though it was quite a distance to her destination, Stenack did not offer to get a taxi. He observed that as the night was pleasant, it would be nice to walk part way, to which Pat, somewhat surprised, assented. Immediately, and with no more self-consciousness than an animal, he became intimately autobiographical. He told her that he was a Russian, a philosophic anarchist, with no belief in or use for society's instituted formulas, marriage, laws, government, nothing but the eternal right of the individual to express himself to the utmost in his chosen medium of life. All his assertiveness had left him. He talked honestly and interestingly. Pat caught glimpses of a personality as simple and, in some ways, as innocent as a child's, credulous, eager, resolute, confident, trusting, and illumined with a lambent inner fire. "I was rude to you at first," he confessed. "I am sorry, but I could not help it. I am like that." "You shouldn't be," she chided. "Tell me what I should be and I will be it," he declared. "You could make me anything. When you came into the room, even though I was angry, there was a flash of understanding between us. You felt it too?" "I felt something," admitted she, "but I was angry myself. How silly of you to give yourself the airs of genius." "I have genius," he averred quietly. Such profound conviction was in his tone that Pat was ready to believe him. As they turned to the elevated stairs, he asked, "Will you come to my studio soon for music?" "Who else will be there?" "Nobody, just you and I." "No, I couldn't do that. Ask Mrs. Carroll and I'll come." "Why should you not come alone? Are you afraid of me? That would be strange." "Of course I'm not afraid of you, but—" "I will not make love to you. I will only make music to you." Pat reflected that it might well prove to be much the same thing. When she left him, it was with a half-promise. Before the week was out, she had gone to his studio. Within the fortnight, she had been there 6 times. She was drawn back to him by the lure of his marvelous music. "I play for no one as I play for you," he said, and by the fascination of his strange and single-minded personality. Not only did he play for her, but he made her sing, experimenting with her voice, pointing out her errors, instructing her, laughing to shame her impatiences and little mutinies, himself patient with the endurance and insight of the true artist. Ever responsive to genuine quality of whatever kind, Pat let herself become more and more involved in imagination and vagrant possibilities. In the matter of love-making, he was faithful to his word. While she was his guest, he never so much as offered to kiss her, rather to her resentful disappointment, to tell the truth. But when, one November afternoon, he was walking with her to where her car was waiting, he said without preface, "Colleen, I love you." He had taken to calling her Colleen after hearing her sing an Irish ballad of that title. Pat liked it. She gave her veiled and somber glance. "Do you really love me?" "You know it. And you?" "I don't know." "I think you do." "I think it would be very stupid of me to fall in love with you." "Why?" "We're not the same kind at all. Some day I shall marry and settle down and be good and happy and correct ever after. You don't believe in marriage." "I believe in love, and in faith to be kept between two who love. Don't you?" "When you play to me, I do. You can make me believe anything then. Then come back, Colleen, and let me play to you." "No," said Pat in self-protective panic. She could not make herself look at him. "When are you coming again?" "I don't know," she answered and popped into her car as if it were sanctuary. Wayward thoughts of his flame-deep eyes, his persuasive speech, the subtle passion of his music made restless many nights for her thereafter. Edna Carroll, suspecting the progress of the affair, questioned her. "What are you up to with Leo?" "Just playing around." "With fire?" "He's got it all right, the fire. I wonder if it's the divine fire." "How seriously are you thinking of him, Pat?" Edna's piquant face was anxious. "You wouldn't marry him?" "Are you afraid for me?" "No, for him." "You're too flattering." "I'm in earnest. You'd ruin him. You're too selfish and too capricious to be the mate of a genius. And he's going to be a great genius, Pat, if he keeps himself straight and undivided. You'd divide him. He's quite mad over you, told me so himself." "How do you know I'm not mad over him?" "God forbid! It would never last with you. Because he isn't your kind, you'd grow away from him, and he'd be wretched, and that would react on his music." "And you think more of his music than of me," pouted Pat. The artist in Edna Carroll, humble and slight in degree though it were, spoke out the true creed of all artistry, which is one. "Not of him, of his genius. Where you find genius, you have to think of it and cherish it above everything." "Above love?" asked Pat. She understood enough of this pure passion to be a little daunted. "Above everything," reaffirmed the other. "You needn't be afraid. He doesn't want to marry me." "Whether he does or not, it's a dangerous fascination for both of you." Vacillating days followed for Pat. There was a week in which she did not trust herself to see Leo. He telephoned and wrote frantically. She did not answer his letters. But one day she met him fortuitously on the street and went to the studio with him. There he broke all bounds, poured out the fire of his heart upon her. He loved her, wanted her, needed her. She was part of his genius. Without her he could never reach his full artistic stature. She loved him too. He felt it. He knew it. He defied her to deny it, and she found out that, under the compulsion of his presence, she could not. He was going to Boston on the following day for a week. Would she come and join him, if only for a day? She could make up some tale for her family, pretend to be staying with a friend. And he would take her to a great singing master, the greatest, a friend of his whom he wanted to hear and try her voice. Wouldn't she trust herself to him and come? Pat denied him vehemently, but she was stirred and troubled to her own passionate depths by his stormy yet controlled passion. He had not so much as touched her hand. In the hallway as they went out, she turned to him and yielded herself into his arms. "Oh, well," she murmured, her voice fluttering in her throat. "I don't care. I'll come. Only, don't rush me. Give me time." They parted with the one kiss of that embrace. Instantly she had agreed. The spirit of adventure rose within her. She was recklessly jubilant. 3 days of alternating morbid self-examination and flushed excitement followed. She looked forward to the meeting, not so much with conscious physical anticipation, as with a sense of something vivid and bold and new coming, as relief, into the too monotonous pattern of life. The rendezvous was arranged by letter. She was to take a late afternoon train, and he was to be at the Back Bay to meet her. Looking from the window as the train pulled in, she saw him restlessly pacing the platform on the wrong side. He had on a new overcoat which did not fit him, and was incongruously glossy as compared with his untidy hair and rumpled soft hat. As his coat slumped open, she was conscious of an unpressed suit underneath. Probably greasy. At the moment he dropped one of the brand new gloves in his hand. She could not recall ever having seen him wear gloves, and bent awkwardly to recover it. His head protruded, his collar, truant from its retaining rear button, hunched muscly up, and she looked down with a dismal revulsion of the flesh upon an expanse of sallow, shaven neck. Unbidden, vividly intrusive, there rose to the eyes of her quickening imagination the image of Carrie Scott, always impeccable of dress and carriage, hard-knit of frame, exhaling the atmosphere of smooth skin and hard muscle. In fancy she breathed the very aroma of him, clean, tingling, masculine, and felt again the imperative claim of his arms. From the groping figure below her, glamour fell like a decaying garment. She forgot the genius, the inner fire, beheld only the outer shell, uncouth, pulpy, nauseous to her senses. With cheeks afire and chin high, she walked up the aisle, turned into the ladies' room, and found safe refuge there, until the train moved on. At the South Station she took the next train back to New York. The image of Carrie Scott bore her unsolicited company. She went straight to Edna Carroll with the story. Edna was alarmed, relieved, puzzled. "But after going so far, why?" she demanded. In response, Pat delivered one of those final and damning sentences upon man which women express only to women. "When I saw him that way, I knew that his socks would be dirty." End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of Flaming Youth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by MrsLSid. Flaming Youth by Samuel Hopkins Adams, Chapter 31. "I'm off, men," confidently wrote Pat in her diary. "There's nothing to it for me. From now on I'm going to be so nice and careful and mind your steppy that the place won't know me. All the old cats in Dorisdale will purr when I come around. I think I shall take up slumming. Anyway, no more flutters for little Pat. I've reformed." In proof of which she comported herself with great circumspection for a space of several months, to the surprise of all, and the discomfiture of sundry amatory youths of her circle. The word went about that Pat Fentress was slowing up. While as much fun as ever in a crowd, she was less approachable in a corner. Pat, her peculiar radiance deepening and ripening, was content with the crowd. Her quickening intelligence was impatient of the callousness and shallowness of her contemporaries among the youth of the suburb. To fill her time in a newly and purely unselfish interest had come into her life, not so showy as the slumming which she had considered, but of far more practical beneficence. At the time of T. Jamison James's accident, she had devoted herself with centered enthusiasm to the sufferer and his household. Later, as the tragedy became a commonplace to her mind, she drifted wide of it. It was natural to the shallow fervors and shifting interests of her youth that she should unconsciously drop out of mind that silent and shadowed personality in the big house across the town. When she did think of it, temporary self-reproach would send her there 2 or 3 times in a week. But there seemed to be nothing that she could do, and she would drop away again. It was an episode of one of these visits that changed her attitude. On her arrival, Dee had told her that Jim was probably asleep. She could creep up softly and see. The attendant who pushed the wheeled chair was out. Tiptoeing to the open door, Pat peered in at the crack. T. Jameson James lay very stiff and still on the window divan, apparently sleeping. Pat was just about to turn away with a sense of relief when she noticed the hand nearest her. It was so tightly clenched that the flesh around the nails was white. His head turned quite gradually, bringing the contour of the face into view. She saw that the eyes were closed, but in the corners 2 drops of water gathered and grew, slowly, slowly, as if wrung from the very core of a soul's repressed agony. The drops broke, darted, trickled down like rain along a window pane. A slight shudder lifted his breast. Then he was immobile again. Pat crept away until she reached the refuge of the lower floor. She ran into the garden, kept on running to the far extent of the grounds, flung herself down, and so lay. She did not collapse, she did not cry. But presently, unpoetic and anticlimactic though it be to record plain facts, the stress of sudden emotion on top of a hearty luncheon had its logical effect. Pat was violently sick. As soon as she recovered breath and poise, she returned to the house with a plan in mind, stamped noisily upstairs, and entered the sick room. "Hello, Jimmy Jams." "Hello, Pat." His face lighted up a little. She was miserably conscious that he had always welcomed her with a smile. "How are you feeling?" "All right." This was his invariable formula. "Don't lie to me." She closed the door, lowered the window, and turned upon him. "Jimmy." "Well?" "Swear." "All right, I swear. What's the secret?" "Not that kind of swear. Cuss. Rip it out. Blast the ceiling off the roof. Let yourself go." He peered into her face. It was solemn, intent. "I don't know what—" he began. Then he broke off and let himself go. Such virulent, vitriolic, blazing, throbbing profanity Pat had never dreamt of. It comprehended the known universe and covered the history of the cosmos, past, present, and future. When he had finished and lay back exhausted, she inquired, "Feel better, don't you?" "Yes. How did you know?" "I saw you a few minutes ago when your eyes were holding in. But you couldn't help. There was—" She touched her own eyelids. "You're a liar, Pat," exploded the correct and punctilious T. Jameson James. "That's right. Go to it if you haven't got it all out," approved Pat. "No. I'm through. Lord, that did me good." "Cussing to yourself is no good. You've got to have somebody to listen. Ever let anyone hear you really loosen up before?" "No. I've always been too, he grinned, "hellish dignified." "Well, you send for me when you need an audience." From that time, a bond of special sympathy and fellowship was established between the life so disastrously wrecked and the life so triumphantly burgeoning. Every morning after breakfast, Pat called him on the phone, and every noon she came over for an hour's chat, until Dee, grateful beyond her self-contained power to express, threatened to sue her sister for alienation of her husband's affections. Nothing, of however much appeal to Pat, was permitted to interfere with this regimen. Through this it was that she had her quarrel with Monty Standish. After 3 years of hard-working athletic obscurity, Standish had suddenly blossomed out into flaming football prominence. His picture appeared in the sporting pages of the metropolitan dailies. His condition was the subject of commentary in the papers, as serious as that accorded to an ailing king. He was of a gallant and alluring type, a bonny lad, handsome, spirited, good-humored, well-mannered, sluggish of mind as he was alert of body, but with a magnetism almost as imperative as Pat's own. He had quite withheld his homage from her, ostentatiously refusing to compete in the circle of her adorers, so she was the more surprised and gratified when he asked her to join his sister's party for the big game. It cost her a real pang to decline, but when he hotly resented her refusal and demanded an explanation,
He was rather spoiled by all the local adulation and newspaper notoriety, which were the guerdon of his prowess. Pat refused to be catechized. There was a scene, angry on his part, scornful on hers, and he departed, darkly indicating that if Princeton lost the game on his side of the line, the true responsibility for the catastrophe would rest upon her contemptuous shoulders. How T. Jamison James got wind of the controversy she never knew, but on the day of the game he called her to account. "Why didn't you go down to Princeton?" "Didn't want to," she said airily. "Monty Standish asked you, didn't he?" "He said something about it." "They say he's the greatest end we've had for 10 years. James was a Princeton alumnus. He's a good-looking youngster, Pat." The girl flushed and her eyes shone. "He's a winner to look at," she agreed. "They tell me you've added him to your collection." "That's all guff," replied the inelegant Pat. "Is it? The point is that you wouldn't go because you felt you had to come here. Isn't that so?" "I didn't want to go anyway," lied Pat gallantly. "I'm worn with football twice a week." "Well, you've got to stop spoiling me by coming here every day. It's bad for me. The doctor says so. I won't have it." "Are you going to close the house to me?" retorted Pat saucily. "You'll have to hire a guard. Go on, swear, Jimmy." "Oh, you go to the devil," said the invalid, laughing. "If Princeton loses today—" But Princeton won, and Pat was saved from the undying remorse which should, but probably would not, have consumed her spirit had Standish fallen down and involved his team in defeat. He came back the following weekend, a hero of the first caliber, and undertook to ignore Pat at the Saturday dance at which he was the unofficial guest of honor. It would have been a more successful attempt if his eyes had not constantly strayed from whatever partner he was with, to follow Pat's pliant and swaying form in the arms of some happier man. On the morrow his stern resolution, already weakened, was totally melted by a talk which he had with T. Jamison James, who had sent for him ostensibly to ask about the game. For a front-page newspaper hero, he was amazingly humble when he called up Pat to ask if he might come and see her. Pat, her heart swelling with pride and not without a flutter of other emotions, said that he might, if he would apologize properly. Mr. Standish did apologize properly and handsomely, and by the time the apology was concluded, Pat was mildly astonished at finding herself in his arms, being fervently kissed and returning the kisses with no less fervor. She was further surprised to find, when he bade her good night, that she was engaged to him. But the really astounding feature of the whole matter came when she awoke the next morning to a sense of the prevailing luminosity of the world, and the conviction that she was thrillingly in love. She had thought that she was through with all that. For a long time, anyway. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of Flaming Youth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by MrsLSid. Flaming Youth by Samuel Hopkins Adams, Chapter 32. They had been engaged for 4 months. On the whole, Pat found the status highly satisfactory. Everyone heartily approved the match. Because of Monty's college duties, which pressed sorely upon him as he was having constant difficulty in keeping up, they saw little of each other, a fortunate circumstance, as the glamour of her lover's physical beauty and personal charm persisted in her mind when they were separated, creating a romantic figure to which no special mental attributes were essential. Had they been thrown more constantly together, she might have been disillusioned by the torpid and unimaginative quality of his mind. But in their brief association over weekends, they were surrounded by others, and when they were alone, his ardent love-making eked out the scantness of his conversational resources. If sometimes, Carrie Scott's words, companionship, the rarest thing in life or love, recurred to her, arousing unwelcome questions, she put them away. Scott's image had dimmed again. In the hot radiance of this new attraction, she determinedly kept it far in the background,
but there was one unrelenting memory which refused to be permanently immured in the past. When the time for the wedding was set, mid-June, immediately after Monty's graduation, if he succeeded in graduating, she realized that she must face the memory and dispose of it for her own peace of mind. Her uneasy thoughts turned to Dr. Bobs. Perhaps he could lay the ghost. "Bobs, what do you really think of Monty?" She had gone to his office, nerved up to the interview. Osterhout considered. "He means well," was his judicial pronunciamento. "What a rotten thing to say about a girl's best young man. What's the matter with him?" "Stupid." "Then you didn't really mean your congratulations." "Certainly. It's an excellent engagement." "Am I stupid, Bobs?" she pouted. "No, but I think you'll be perfectly satisfied with a stupid husband." "I don't know what makes you so revolting today," complained Pat. "I'd be bored to death with a boob around the house, and you know it. He's not stupid." "If you're satisfied, I am," said the amiable Bobs. "I don't have to live with him. He's a prize beauty, all right, and rich." "There you go again. I don't care. I love Monty, and that's enough. Anyway, I didn't come here to talk about him exactly. It's something else. Bobs, do many girls confess to their doctors?" Osterhout looked up sharply and frowned. Almost word for word, Mona had put that same query to him years before. But Pat's face was more childlike, graver than that of the lovely, laughing, reckless Mona had been. "Probably more than to their priests," he made reply. "That's what a doctor is for." "Yes," she cried eagerly. "Please just be the Fentress family physician for a few minutes. Make it easy for me, Bobs dear." Indefinably his manner changed with his next words, became quietly attentive, soothing, almost impersonal as he said, "Take your time, Pat, and when you're ready, tell me as much or as little as you wish." "It isn't too easy, even to you. Can't you guess?" "Ah," said he after a pause of scrutiny. "So that's it." "Don't look at me." She put her hands up as if to shield her face from flame. "Just tell me what to do." "Are you in trouble?" "Of course," said she impatiently. "Do you think I'd come bothering you?" "Oh, no, not that way. Though it might have happened. Now you do know." "Go on, Pat." "Aren't you shocked?" Her eyes darted up at him, at once supplicating and defiant, from out the tangle of her vagrant hair. "Not a bit. We doctors don't judge. We help." "Oh, Bobs, you are divine. I want to know, it's awfully hard to put it, to know whether, if he'll know when we're married." "He?" Osterhout groped in a murk of bewilderment. "Who?" "Monty, of course. Don't be dumb." "Monty? Isn't Monty the man?" "Oh, no." For the moment, Osterhout was startled clean out of his professional attitude. "Who is?" he said sternly. Instantly, Pat was mutinous. "I won't tell you." "I'm sorry I asked it. It's none of your doctor's affair who he is. You want me to tell you whether your husband, when you marry, will know that you have had experience before." "Yes," answered Pat under her breath. "I'll answer you as I always answer that question." "Always? Have you had it asked you before?" A slight, melancholy, tolerant smile lifted the corners of the strong mouth. "My dear, every doctor who has had among his patients specimens of the modern high-strung girl has had that problem put up to him. The answer is simple. No, he won't know, unless you tell him." She drew a sharp breath of relief, but almost at once her face darkened, as the import of his last words made its way to her quick sensitiveness. "Do you want me to tell him?" "That is not a question for a physician to answer." Pat stamped her foot. "Stop being one, then. Be Bobs again. Shall I tell him, Bobs?" Has he ever told you anything of that nature?
No. Perhaps there isn't anything to tell, though I don't suppose he's exactly one of them damn virgins.
What do you know about him?
Osterhout gave himself full time to debate the answer within himself before responding.
There was a raid last year on a notorious roadhouse near here. Several of our best youth, if you reckon them by family, were caught. Montgomery Standish was one of them.
Ugh, shuddered Pat. A vile joint like that? Why didn't you tell me before, Bobs?
He shrugged his shoulders. You'd have to go pretty wide of your own set to find a boy with a clean record. Monty is no worse than the rest.
What beasts men are!
He might say if he knew anything, what crooks girls are.
You don't mean that it's the same thing, said Pat beneath her breath. He goes to a rotten place, probably drunk.
Undoubtedly.
And, oh, it makes me sick to think of it. It isn't the same. I may have been a silly little fool, but, oh, Bobs, can't you understand?
Who was the man, Bambina?
At the old term of affection, her face softened. Can't you guess, Bobs, dear? She whispered. A blinding, burning illumination lighted up his memory of 100 small, vitally significant facts against which the sudden certainty stood forth, black and stark. Carrie Scott, by God! Pat's face was set. Her eyes, somber but fearless, answered him.
The damned scoundrel!
He isn't.
Isn't? A man of his age to come into a house as a friend and seduce an innocent child?
He didn't seduce me any more than I seduced him.
Don't talk infernal nonsense.
It's true. It's true, and you've got to believe it. It was as much my fault as his.
Was it your fault that he left you like a coward?
He didn't. I sent him away. He wanted to get free and marry me, and would have done it if I'd let him. He was terribly in love with me, Bobs. Monty doesn't love me that way. Nobody ever will again.
Well, why wouldn't you marry him? Queried the amazed physician.
Oh, I don't know. She gave her shoulders the childish, petulant wriggle of old, again the petite gamine of Scott's patient love. He's so old.
Then why in the name?
You're full of whys, Bobs. It happened, that's all. Nobody ever knows why nor how in these things, do they? I just lost my footing and drew him with me, if you want the truth of it.
I'm beginning to believe you, but I still think he's...
She flattened a hand gently across his lips. No, you don't. He's the best man I've ever known, except perhaps you, Bobs. If you were in Monty's place and I came to you and told the whole thing, you'd marry me anyway, wouldn't you?
Yes, of course.
But you don't think Monty would?
I didn't say so. He's very young and unformed.
Pat fell into a reverie. It was really my mind that Carrie seduced. He drew my mind into his and sort of absorbed it, so that I couldn't get any satisfaction out of other associations. You wouldn't call him a damn scoundrel for that.
I'm not so sure I wouldn't.
But it's the thing he's most to blame for. It's worse than the other. It goes deeper.
You're getting profound, Pat, as well as clever.
In spite of his perturbation, the doctor smiled.
Though you're talking casuistry.
I don't know what that is. I'm talking sense. I've almost forgotten that Carrie and I were lovers. But there's something way down deep in my mind that he'll never lose his hold on.
You're in love with him yet, then?
I'm not, she denied vehemently. I'm in love with Monty, violently.
I wish he were 10 years older, or 1,000 or so wiser. Then I'd say, tell him the whole thing. As it is, no. He's marrying your future, not your past. If you're going to play straight with him...
Absolutely, she averred. I won't look at another man after we're married.
What about that restlessness of the mind, though? All done with. What's the good? You have more fun if you're stupid. You were always wanting me to marry somebody old enough to be my grandfather, Bobs, but... Ah, yes, he cut in grimly. Now you're going to answer me some questions. How came you to know that about my wanting you to marry a man over 30? If I tell you, you'll be paralyzed. Go ahead, paralyze me. I read it in your letters. What letters? He asked, stupefied. The ones to Mother. Oh, Bobs, I think they were too flawless. No one but a darling like you could have written them. Wait a moment. He put his hand to his head. His science-circumscribed world of materialism was toppling about him. How did you know about them? That I was writing them? Where to find them? Mother told me. Mona. Pat, I want the truth. I'm giving it to you. Before she died, when I saw her there in New York, she told me how she had made you a promise to write and put the letters in the safe, and the real reason was, not that she thought she would ever come back to read them, but she thought you were the wisest and best man in the world, and she knew how fond you were of all of us, and she wanted me to know what you thought and be guided by what you said. I suppose she figured that you'd say more about me that way than you ever would to me. So you did. Osterhout gave a great laugh, partly of relief, partly of tenderness. That's so like Mona. Her passion for intrigue just for the sake of the game itself. Her eternal loving cleverness. There are mighty few people, Pat, in whom affection is a thing of the mind as well as of the heart. Your mother was one of them. So am I, asserted Pat promptly. What's the matter now, Bobs? For his face had altered again, his brow drawing heavily down, his eyes become still and brooding. It won't do, Pat. You're not telling me the truth. Not the whole truth. After your mother died, I changed the combination of the safe. The girl's laugh had a queer, strained quality. I know you did. What of it? How could you get the letters to read? I couldn't at first. But you claim that you did. How? Well, it was a dream. At least it must have been a dream, or else, I don't know. Mother came back one night and took me by the hand and led me into her room to the safe. And when I woke up, the door was open, and the numbers of the combination were in my brain as clearly as if someone had just spoken them in my ear. Were you frightened, Pat? Not a bit. Isn't it strange? After that, I could open it myself any time. Pat, do you really think... He began hoarsely and stopped. Do I think it was her spirit? I don't know. It was something. It was something, he repeated. Something from the other side, a lifting of the curtain. For you, not for me. Well, he sighed. No more letters. Why not? Why should there be? Whatever I've got to say to you, I can say direct, now that the secret is out. It was really to you that I was writing all the time, so it appears. It wasn't. It was to her. How do you know she doesn't know, doesn't read them and love them? You must keep them up, Bobs. He shook his head, but his veiled glance roved to the mahogany desk in the corner. Instantly Pat interpreted it. There's one there, an unfinished one. Let me read it. As you like. It's only just begun. About your engagement. It doesn't matter anyway now. A lost illusion. From a locked secret drawer he took the letter, only a single sheet. An inspiration came to Pat. I'm going to add a P.S. May I? Yes. Seating herself, she ran through the brief words, then wrote busily. Having finished, she leaned back in her chair to consider her companion. Bobs, she announced with deliberation, I think I'll let you read what I've written. Shall I? He held out his hand. She put the missive into it. He read, Dearest, Bobs thinks he's still in love with you. He means to be faithful, poor old boy, but he really loves Dee. She knows it way inside her, the way women know, and she's coming to care for him too. That is why she is so shy and standoffish with him, not a bit like Con and me. But he hasn't the sense to see it. It's time he knew it, that both of them knew it. Poor, brave old Jimmy Jams is going to pass out one of these days and be rid of all his pains. He knows it. He told me last week, we're the greatest pals ever, that he wouldn't last a year. There was someone else that Dee was crazy about, but she's given that up. It's over. So when Jimmy Jams passes along, it's up to Bobs, if he's a man and not an old fossil, to step forward. Dee's been a widow long enough. That is what you would want for them both, isn't it, dear? I know it is. Osterhout walked over to the window. His face was white, his bulky frame trembling. The betraying sheet of paper fluttered away from his fingers. Suddenly, warm arms were about his neck, soft lips were pressed to his cheek, a breath that wavered against his ear like a fragrant breeze of spring formed the words gaily spoken. Oh, Bobs, who cares a darn for a lost illusion when the reality is so much sweeter? End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of Flaming Youth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by MrsLSid. Flaming Youth by Samuel Hopkins Adams, Chapter 33. From the time when Dr. Osterhout assured her of her secret safety, Pat knew that she must tell her fiancé before the wedding. Some quirk of feminine psychology would have justified her in concealment so long as there was risk, the chances of the game. But to go forward upon the path of marriage in perfect safety and with an unsuspecting mate, that was, in her mind, mean. Curiosity, too, that restless, morbid craving to know what exciting thing would result, pressed her. The daring experimentalist was rampant within her. How would Monty take it? What would he do? How should she tell him? Opportunity paved the way. A group of her set were at Holiday Knoll on a Saturday evening, discussing the local sensation of the day. Generously measured highballs had been distributed, and in the dim conservatory, lighted only by the glow of cigarettes, they discussed the event. A betrothed girl of another suburb had committed suicide after the breaking of her engagement, and gossip ascribed the tragedy to the inopportune discovery of an old love affair. With the freedom of the modern flapper, Margaret Thorne, half lying in the arms of Nick Torrance on the settee, declared the position. It was the Teddy Barnaby business. 2 years ago, we all thought they were engaged. Weren't they? Asked someone. More or less, asseverated the sprightly Miss Thorne. Chiefly more from all accounts. Then Johnny Dupuy came here to live, and she shifted her young affections to him and caught him. Do you think he found out about Teddy? Sure, like a Bible. How? Why pick on me for a hard one like that? Perhaps she told him, suggested one of the other girls. She wouldn't be such a boob, no girl would, offered a languid, girlish voice. It'd be the square thing to do. This was a masculine opinion, and jejune even for that crowd. Don't know. Yeah, declared Miss Thorne, meaning to express her contempt for this view. It was up to Dupuy to look in the mare's mouth before he bought. The discussion played about the subject with daring sallies and prurient relish, the final conclusion of the majority being that the fiancé had got wise, and the girl had killed herself because he broke the engagement, as any fellow would. Monty Standish's contribution this last. What if she did go to him and own up? Suggested Selden Thorpe. It'd be just the same, opined Standish. He'd have to quit. Oh, I don't know. It doesn't follow. Wouldn't you? I don't know that I would. It depends. You'd be a pretty poor sort of fish if you wouldn't. Maybe, if I thought as you do, but we don't all think the same. Some of us don't think at all, put in Pat acidly. "We just talk." "Meaning which, Treachy?" inquired Torrance. "Oh, nothing." "I know John Dupuy," proceeded Thorpe. "He isn't just exactly the one to draw lines too strictly." "I grant you that Johnny would never win the diamond-set chastity belt of the World's Championship," said the daring Miss Thorne, and elicited a chorus of appreciative mirth. Pat did not join in. She was thinking fast and hard. After the rest had gone, Monty stayed on, as of right. Something in Pat's expression struck even his torpid perceptions as he put his arm around her and drew her to him for the customary petting party. "What's all the gloom about, sweetie?" She released herself not overly gently. "Monty, would you have done what Dupuy did?" "How do you mean?" "Broken off your engagement. On that account?" "Why, yes, any fellow would." A convincing reason for him. "Selden Thorpe wouldn't." "I'll bet he would. He's a bluff. He makes me sick." "Well, then, you'd better break ours." "I don't get you, Pat." "It's been the same with me as with Elsie Dowden. I've been meaning to tell you." "I don't believe it," he said violently. "It's a try-on, a trick." "It's true. You've got to believe it." "Who's the man?" bayed Monty like a huge dog. "I'll never tell you." He gathered his powerful frame together as if to spring upon her. If he did, if he beat her to the ground, choked her into helplessness, Pat thought, she would hate him and love him for it. But his rage ebbed, impotent of its culmination, a little pitiful, a little ridiculous. What did you do it for?" It was almost a whisper. "I don't know. I didn't mean to at the beginning." "Did you love him?" "Yes, I thought I did." "You love him now," he charged, his fury mounting again. "I don't. I love you." "This is a hell of a thing to tell a man you say you love," he faltered plaintively. "You'd rather I hadn't told you. I'm not built that way. I had to tell." Instantly he was suspicious. "Had to? Why did you have to?" "Not for any reason that you'd understand." The slight emphasis on the "you" was the first touch of bitterness she had allowed herself. "Wouldn't he marry you?" "I wouldn't marry him." Monty perceptibly brightened. Pat's womanly intuitions, supersensitized by the strain of the contest, told her why. If, to his male standards, she was a maiden despoiled, she was at least not a woman scorned. Her rating had gone up sensibly. "Where is he now?" "I don't know. I haven't seen him for a long time. I'll never see him again." "Pat," with an air of absolute magnanimity, "if you tell me who it was, I'd marry you anyway." At that her pale cheeks flamed. "I'm not begging you to marry me, Monty. I'm not that cheap in the market." "You want our engagement broken?" "That's up to you, absolutely. If you think, now I've told you, that you're so much better and purer than I am because I've done what I did." "What do you mean, better and purer?" "I suppose you've never had any affair with any girl." "Are you trying to pretend to believe that's the same thing?" His voice was incredulous, contemptuous. "Why isn't it the same thing?" Young Mr. Standish suffered a paralysis of scandalized amazement. "Because it isn't. For God's sake, you talk like one of those radical freaks that spout on soapboxes." "I'm not so sure they aren't right about this man and woman thing," declared Pat recklessly. In so speaking, she felt that she had broken with conventionalities far more than in anything, however bold, previously enunciated in their talk. Monty's square jaw became ugly. "I'm giving you your chance. You won't tell me the man's name?" Pat preserved the silence of obstinacy. It was more convincing than any negative, also more exasperating. "Good night," bellowed her lover and strode from the room. Almost immediately he was back, endued with a sad and noble expression. "Nobody shall ever know about this from me, Pat. You're safe." For 3 nights Pat washed her troubled soul with tears. Her family knew that there had been a lover's quarrel, that was all. Pat waited for Monty to break the engagement formally or send her word that he wished her to break it. Through all her grief of bereavement, which she repeatedly told herself was the most sorrowful depth that her life had yet touched, that any life could touch, she impatiently awaited the definite solution. Relief from the strain of uncertainty, that was what she craved. On the 4th evening Monty reappeared. All his nobleness was gone. He was haggard, nerve-racked, forlorn. He threw himself upon her compassion. He implored her. He would forgive everything. He would forget everything. He would make no conditions, if only she would take him back. Life without her— "All right, Monty boy," said Pat, really affected by his suffering. "I haven't changed. I love you, Monty. But if ever you let what I've told you make any difference, if ever you speak of it or let me know that you even think of it, I'm through. That minute and forever." Humbly, abjectly, the upholder of man's superior privilege accepted the absurd condition. The stronger nature had completely dominated the weaker. Back in his arms again, Pat savored the delicious warmth of a passion the more ardent for the threat of frustration, the triumph of a crisis valorously met and successfully passed. But an encroaching thought tainted the rapture of the moment. Was it that he himself had so confidently said to Selden Thorpe? Was her splendid and beautiful young lover holding the views which he had proclaimed and surrendering them so readily, indeed, a poor sort of fish? End of chapter 33. Chapter 34 of Flaming Youth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by MrsLSid. Flaming Youth by Samuel Hopkins Adams, Chapter 34. Again, Pat was happy in her engagement. She frequently and insistently assured herself that she was. Certainly she had no just complaint of Monty. He was all that a lover should be when they were together. He kept to his pact and never in any manner referred to Pat's confession. But when he was away, she sometimes wished that he wouldn't write so often, or, at least, expect her to answer so regularly. His letters added nothing to his charm. They innocently bristled with eyes, but it was the monotony rather than the egotism of his style that annoyed her. Her answers, at first ardent, vivid and flashing like herself, soon became mere chronicles of petty events, interspersed with protestations of love. They were temporarily genuine enough, these latter, since each time he was with her she was rewarmed in the glow of their mutual passion. But she could not stifle all misgivings. Incompetent though she was to analyze comprehensively her changeful emotions, she nevertheless had disturbing gleams of self-knowledge which added nothing to her confidence in a future whereof Monty Standish was to be a large part. Pat dimly recognized herself for that difficult and composite type of girlhood which, though imperatively sexed, will never fulfill itself through physical attraction and physical satisfactions alone. For such as she there must be the double response. If the mating be not both mentally and physically sufficient, ultimate disaster is inevitable. Brooding upon these self-suspicions, she would fall into moods of silence and withdrawal, puzzling to the matter-of-fact lover who would sometimes grow quite petulant over her perfunctory responses to his good-humored ineffectualities of companionship. Once when he rallied her upon this, she burst into angry tears and snapped out, "I'm so damn worn with piffle and prattled," and darted upstairs. But at their next meeting she was so prettily contrite in yielding that his vanity was quite soothed. As the wedding day drew near, Pat dismissed whatever doubts she may have had in the excitement of fitting out. It was on one of these shopping expeditions, when she had gone into town by train, her runabout having suffered an attack of nervous breakdown, that, crossing the station plaza, she came face to face with an old but unforgotten acquaintance. She saw his keen, pleasant face light up, could read in his half-dismayed expression the struggle to remember exactly who she was, and went to him, holding out her hand. "You've forgotten me, Mr. Warren Graves." He took the hand. "Indeed I haven't. It's Pat, little Pat." She nodded. "Better than I gave you credit for." "I'm awfully sorry, but I have forgotten the rest of it." "Pat'll do," she laughed. "No, but let me think back." "Want any help?" "It was a party, somewhere about here. A corking party. I'd had one drink that I remember and some more that I don't. A funny, delightful kitty was floating around outside like Cinderella. She wouldn't go in and dance with me, but let me think." "I wouldn't think too far," urged Pat, her face tinged with pink. "Ah, but I've got the name now," he cried, triumphant and tactful at once. "Fentress. Miss Patricia Fentress, alias Pat, alias the infant, alias the demon. What a relieving memory you've got. Who stood at the bend of the stairs and said goodnight so sweetly that I never quite got over it. But I say, you have grown up." He looked at her piquant, provocative, welcoming face and continued, with a gleam of mischief in his eyes. "Now that I'm recovering from the shock, I seem to recall an older sister protruding from a door most inopportunely. Aren't you afraid you'll miss your train, Mr. Graves?" "I'm not going to the train." "You're carrying that satchel for exercise?" "I'm wishing it onto the parcels stand while I take a delightful young lady to luncheon." "Surely you must be keeping her waiting." "I'm daring to hope she'll come with me while I pry myself from this baggage. Will you, Pat?" "Oh, you're asking me to lunch with you?" "Such is my dark and deadly purpose." "I ought not to, but I want to." He laughed delightedly. "You haven't changed a bit inside, and most marvelously outside. Then you'll come?" "You'd make a fortune as a mind reader. There's a condition, though." "Name it. It's agreed to." "That you'll forget all about that foolishness of ours at the party. I was only 14. It was his turn to flush. "You make me ashamed of myself," he said with such charming sincerity that Pat let fall a friendly and forgiving hand upon his arm for a second. "But let me tell you this. When I left your house that night, I was more than a little in love with you. Oh, calf love, doubtless. But it makes it a little better, doesn't it?" "Yes," answered Pat gravely. "It makes it a lot better, for both of us." "Then we'll forget all of it that you'd wish forgotten," said he. In her italicized moments, Pat would have described the luncheon that followed as too enticing. But Pat did not feel stressful in the company of Warren Graves. She felt quiet and attentive, and wonderfully receptive to the breadth of the greater world which he brought to her. He had been in the diplomatic service since the war, in several European capitals, had read and thought and mingled with men who were making or marring not the politics alone, but the very geography of the malleable earth. After a little light talk, in which Pat was conscious that he was trying her out, the rapprochement of their minds was established, and he settled down to talk with her as if she had been a woman of the international world in which he moved. Her swift, apprehensive intelligence kept him up to his best form. As the coffee was finished, he said reproachfully, "You've made me chatter my head off, and I'm supposed to have rather a gift for silence. How do you work your spells?" "By being sunk in admiring interest," she answered, smiling up at him as she put on her gloves. "You've given me the most delightful hour I've had for years." "But it needn't end here, need it?" he protested anxiously. "Don't you want to go to a matinee or something?" "There aren't any. It's Friday." "So it is. But there are always the movies." Pat knew that she ought not to go. There were a dozen important errands to be done. "Oh, very well," she said. Duties could wait. Pleasure was something you had to grab before it got away from you. The philosophy of the flapper. At the motion picture palace, they got box seats, the chairs suggestively close together. She wondered whether he would try to hold her hand, also whether she should let him if he did. Probably she would. There was no harm in that, and it gave a pleasant sense of companionship. Most of the boys with whom she went to the theater or movies expected it. Apparently Warren Graves didn't. He made no move in that direction. Piqued a little, nevertheless, Pat liked him the better for it. Monty might perhaps have objected if he knew. And with a start, she discovered that only just then had she thought of Monty Standish. He had been, for the time, quite forgotten in the interest of a more enlivening and demanding association. What the serial of the play was, Pat could hardly have told. Some hurrah about the West, she informed T. Jameson James afterward. At the conclusion of it, there came a news feature showing scenes about the building where the League of Nations session was being held. Various noted personages appeared, walked with the knee-slung unnatural stalk of the screen across the space, and vanished. Then it was as if a blinding flash had been projected from the square. An unforgettable figure stood out amidst the crowd, the face turned toward her, the eyes with the faint ironic lift of the brows, looking down into her soul, arousing a tumult and a throbbing which left her hardly breath enough to gasp out, "Carrie Scott!" "Do you know Scott?" asked her escort interestedly. "Yes, he used to visit in Dorisdale." "Do you?" "Quite well. Everyone on the inside in Europe knows him. He's one of the men who are doing big things under the surface at the conference." "Tell me," urged Pat as they left the place. He sketched Scott's career as confidential advisor to several of the most important of the protagonists in that Titan's struggle. "He's a sort of liaison officer, knowing France and this country as he does. He's had a rather rough time of it lately, poor chap." "Is he ill?" Pat had a struggle to control her voice. "No, a domestic smash. His wife, is a demonish sort of female. However, he's got well rid of her now. To be accurate, he let her get rid of him. Over decent of him, all things considered." Perhaps she had cause too. Pat hated herself as she said it, but she craved to know. "Nothing of that kind," was the positive reply. "Scott has been living like an anchorite. They say he was hard hit here in America. As to that, I don't know. Certainly he has been devoting himself to his work, with no room for any other devotion, which is more than can be said of his ex-wife." "I never met her," Pat heard her voice saying, and quite admired it for its tone of casual interest. "She didn't come to Dorisdale?" "Speaking of Dorisdale, I'm at Washington for a while. Mayn't I run up to see you?" "No, I'm afraid not." "That's a little disappointing." "You see, I'm going to be terribly busy until my wedding." "Wedding? Oh, all my felicitations. I didn't know." "Yes, I'm to be married to Monty Standish next month." Even as her lips spoke the words, her soul denied them. In the dominant depths of her, she knew that she could never marry Monty Standish now. Her thoughts, so lightly detached from her fiancé by the easy charm of Warren Graves, had been claimed, coerced, irrevocably absorbed by the swift-passing phantom presentment of her former lover. The bond created when she had given herself to him was as nothing compared to this imperative summons across the spaces. After a night of passionate struggle, succeeded by resolute thinking, she wired Monty to come on. When he came, she broke the engagement. It was ruthless, cruel, unfair. Pat had no excuses, no extenuations to offer. She simply stood firm. Monty returned to college, failed of his graduation, and let it be known among his indignant friends and relatives that Pat had ruined his career. Hot and righteous though his wrath was, he never so much as hinted at Pat's secret. Stupid, unstable, self-satisfied, spoiled, the plaster idol of an athlete-worshipping age, but nevertheless a gentleman within whom one flame of honor burned clear and constant behind its dull encasement. Pat's family variously raged, begged, and protested. Pat let them. They prophesied social ostracism for her. She shrugged away the suggestion as improbable in the first place and not worth worrying about anyway. But she would have gone away had it not been for her self-assumed responsibility to her broken brother-in-law. And it was from him that her main support came. From the first, he stood by her unquestioning. "You're awfully good to me, Jimmy Jams," she said one day as she was wheeling him in the garden, having dismissed the attendant. "What did you really think when I told you I wasn't going to marry Monty?" A smile of justified cleverness lighted up his pain-worn face. "I'd never thought that you would." "Cute little Jimmy. Why not?" "Too much brains. He'd never keep you interested, and you found it out in time." "Not too soon," observed the girl with a grimace. "The family are still raising Mary Hades about it." "Naturally. You don't think you're entitled to any Sunday school award for good behavior on the thing, do you?" "No, I don't," admitted Pat, but she pouted. A silence fell between them. It lasted for a full turn around the garden. Tired of pouting, Pat broke it. "Want to play bezique, Jimmy?" "No." "Want me to read to you?" "No, dear." "What the devil do you want?" "Oh, I'm sorry, Jimmy. I believe I've got nerves. Never knew there were such things before." "Pat, stop the chair." "What's the idea, Jimmy?" "Come around here where I can see you." "As per order." "I know the man." "What man?" "The other man." "I've been acquainted with several of them in my life." "So I've been given to understand. I'm talking about the man on whose account you broke your engagement." "You're seeing things, Jimmy. Monty himself is the nigger in that wood pile." "What about Carrie Scott?" The look with which she faced him did not waver. "Well, what about him?" "He's coming back." "Coming back? Here?" Still her eyes were steady, but there was the faintest catch in her breathing. "Well, no, he isn't. I just said that as an experiment. Though, of course, he might come if you wanted him. You do want him, don't you, Pat, dear?" "Sometimes. Other times I don't. How did you know?" "When you've got nothing to do but think," he explained. "You get tired of thinking about yourself by and begin to think about other people. I've been thinking a lot about you since we got to be pals." "You're a dear, Jimmy Jams." "I'm an old crab, but I'm fond of you. And Scott was good to me too when I was first laid up. When you think hard enough about people you're fond of, you begin to see things about them, even things they may not see themselves." "Even things that maybe aren't there at all," she mocked. "This is there," he asseverated. "There's no use your pretending. When we talk, I'm always catching echoes of Scott's influence in what you say. You're a different Pat from what you were before you knew him. I don't think you'd get on so well with yourself." "You are clever, Jimmy. I don't, and it makes me furious." "At him?" "Yes. I don't know. At myself, too." "I had a letter from him last week. We've carried on a desultory correspondence since he left." Pat's eyes livened. "What does he say about me?" "How do you know he says anything about you?" "Don't tease. Tell Patty." "You ought to know Scott well enough to realize that he isn't the sort to display his feelings in a show window. But there are lines that one could read between. Have you written to him, Pat?" "No." "Aren't you going to send for him?" Her face darkened with troubled memories. "I couldn't. You don't understand. I couldn't, Jimmy." "I could write." "You shan't. You mustn't. If you do, I'll hate you. Promise." "All right, I promise. But don't you really want to see him ever again?" "Sometimes I think I'll die if I don't," she said simply. "Other times, I don't know." "Why not find out?" Won't you let me write?" "No, you've promised." "Very well, I'll keep to it. Take me inside, slave." He did not write. He cabled. End of chapter 34. Chapter 35 of Flaming Youth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by MrsLSid. Flaming Youth by Samuel Hopkins Adams, Chapter 35. Faint spice of budding clematis was fragrant in the air at Holiday Knoll. On her way to the street, Pat passed through the arbor with a little warm shiver of recollection. How long ago that other October seemed, that night when, amidst the scents and seductions of the year's late warmth, she had opened her arms and her lips to Carrie Scott in that first unforgettable red kiss of their passion. How far away, how deep buried under other varied experiences. Would he ever come back? It was many weeks since James had talked of him, suggesting the possibility, and the subject had not again been brought up. Would she really want him back if she could have him? And what would she do with him if he came? Or he with her? Or fate with both of them? Pat had become a good deal of a fatalist. It was a convenient theory and dovetailed neatly with her religion, enabling her to compound with her conscience at the smallest expense of self-blame. Fate, she felt, had saved her from marrying Monty Standish, which was a large count to its credit. Chiefly because of Monty, she was now going down to the village, for he was due back after a long absence for repairs to his damaged heart, and the local old cats had prophesied that Pat would leave town, for a time anyway, if she possesses a grain of decent feeling. Pat proposed to do nothing of the sort. Neither Monty Standish nor any other living specimen of the male sex could run her off the public streets. For excuse, she had some marketing to do, and she set forth with her most nonchalant air and independent shoulder swing. She'd show him whether she was ashamed or afraid to meet Monty. After pervading the town for a while, she would run over for her daily chatter with Jimmy Jams. Jimmy was growing very frail and weary and had a look of eager, anxious expectancy these days. Pat thought that she knew what he was waiting for. There would be a big void in her life when Jimmy got his release. Emerging from the fruit shop where she hoped to find an avocado pear for him, she saw a man standing on the curb. His back was turned, but there was that in the set of his shoulders, the slender grace of the figure, the poise of the head which startled her heart to one great throb of excited delight. Here indeed was relief from dull days, food for that greed of excitement, of thrill, which life had not yet begun to sate for her. "Mr. Scott!" He whirled about, his face lighted up. Taking the hand which she held out, he said with the old mocking half-lift of the brows, "Still that, Pat?" "What are you doing in Dorisdale?" "I've just been telephoning Miss Patricia Fentress." "She's out." "So I was informed. I begin to suspect it's true." Both laughed. Pat, quite charmed with herself for the light and easy manner in which she was carrying off this potentially difficult situation, committed the error of looking up into his eyes. There she read a hunger and a want that made her avert her gaze. She sought hurriedly for something to say. "I didn't even know that you were in this country." "I wasn't until last night." He had fallen into step beside her. "I was going to the Jameses," she remarked a little lamely. "I go there every morning." "Yes, I know. James has written me. You make life bearable for him. It's rather wonderful of you, Pat." "I like to go there," she said in disclaimer of his praise. "Will you come with me?" "Yes, if I may." For 2 squares that was his only remark. Pat grew restless. "You're not too conversational," she complained. "I was thinking," he said quietly, "how very lovely you've grown." "Have I, Carrie?" The soft echo of that old throaty crow was in her voice. I ought to be a ruin. I've had troubles enough. Troubles? You? Haven't you been well? Do you think that's the only kind of trouble a girl can have? There are others. I came near having the worst of 'em 4 months ago. Why then? Date of my wedding, said Pat briefly with intent to create a sensation. She failed. Yes, I heard you were to have been married, he remarked calmly. And the rest of it? That you broke off your engagement, yes. Who told you? I found a letter when the ship docked, from James. Pat's eyes snapped with suspicion. Did Jimmy write you to come back here? From Europe, I mean? He cabled. Jimmy's a... Never mind what he is. I'll tell him to his face when we get there. But when they got there, T. Jameson James, it seemed, was not feeling very brisk. Well enough to have them come up to his room, oh yes, that, and warmly glad to see Scott again. After a few moments' talk, however, he displayed symptoms of weariness. He even hinted that he would be better off for the time without visitors. Pat, with the usual perverseness of her excitement and anticipations, insisted on staying to read to her brother-in-law as usual. This he vetoed outright. No, I don't want you. I'm sleepy. Take Scott over to the knoll for luncheon. He's probably famished. And Dee had to go to town, so there's nothing to be had here. Run along. Her hand being thus forced, Pat issued the invitation, and she and Scott left the sick room. But they had not reached the front door when she turned and darted upstairs again. Throwing herself down by the cripple's couch, she caught his head to her bosom and cherished it there. Oh, Jimmy, you promise breaker, you old liar. I adore you. She pressed a swift kiss on his cheek and was gone. Mr. T. Jameson James made a face at the devil and chuckled himself to sleep. Rejoining Scott outside, Pat commanded, Tell me everything you've been doing in the big, big world. He was unprotestingly obedient, cheerfully impersonal throughout the walk to the knoll. But never had she been more conscious of the quiet compulsion of his charm. Her arms ached for him. They entered the house by the side door. Instinctively, Pat turned toward the conservatory, but some inexplicable revulsion of feeling checked her. No, not there, she said. Let's go to the library. No sooner had the door closed behind them than she turned to his embrace, not so much yielding to as claiming him back. After the long kiss, she stood away from him, but with her hand still clinging upon his shoulders. That makes it seem all real again, she breathed. Have you grown so far away from me as that, my darling? Well, I was going to marry Monty Standish, you know, she reminded him. Yes. Why didn't you? I couldn't. You were in the way. Pat, that's what I feared and dreaded more than... Wait, it isn't what you think. And it isn't all. Before I was engaged to Monty, I ran away with a boy to Boston, and you spoiled that. I don't understand, he said dully. I left him before anything, because... She whirled away from him, flung herself upon the lounge, and blew him an airy kiss. Because I happened to think of you at the wrong time. Or perhaps it was the right time. Anyway, his collar gaped, like a sick fish. And yours always set so beautifully. So I beat it. She was all petite gamine now. You're always getting in my way, Carrie. Aren't you shamed? He smiled at her, his little twisted, tolerant smile. You don't change much, do you, little Pat? Oh, I'm frightfully changed. Much more serious, years older. Lost my girlish illusions, all that sort of thing. You won't like me nearly as much, you're so serious yourself. Her eyes blazed with enjoyment of the situation and the excitement of his proximity. Most of the time I haven't believed it, though. Have you? Believed what, Pat? About us. All of it, I mean. That we were lovers. It got to seem like a dream to me, something way far off, in another life, or like something that had happened to some other girl. It didn't seem real to me, not even when I told Monty. You told him? Had to. What'd you think I'd do? Knowing your courage and honor, that's what I'd think you'd do. The hard, excited glitter softened out of her eyes. I knew you'd want me to, Carrie. Of course, I never told him who the man was. And is that what broke the engagement? It did for a while. Then he came back, but I couldn't stand it. Nothing above the ears, Carrie. It wasn't even the first dreaming for me. You remember what you said that day you drove me over to Sissy's about my marrying and about keeping you in the background of my mind? Yes. But you don't stay there, she complained childishly. You're always popping out and spoiling things. She gave him a challenging look. I was sort of keeping you for my second dreaming. Scott laughed. Pat, dearest, are you flirting with me after I've come 4,000 miles? What did you come for? For you. Her loosely clasped hands stirred and parted. Well, here I am. That's not enough. You don't want much, do you? She murmured. Everything or nothing now. You know I'm free. She nodded. I can see what's coming, she said with a pretense of demureness. If you've hopped across those 4,000 miles from a sense of duty to the weeping girl that you left behind. Pat, don't bark at me. It frazzles my nerves. I haven't done any weeping over you, Carrie. Too busy with the thrills of life. Would you have come back, I wonder, if you could have known everything that's been going on? Suppose I'd stayed in Boston that time. Well, wouldn't that make a difference? In my wanting to marry you? No. Suppose, she said more slowly, I'd had an affair. A real affair with Monty, like ours. A spasm of pain passed over his face. I shouldn't blame you. How could I? Wouldn't it make any difference in your loving me? Not an iota. Wouldn't you even care? She flashed in resentful wrath. Care? Good God, Pat. If you saw a man in torture... Oh, don't, Carrie, dear, she cried, startled and remorseful. It isn't true. It's just my sneaking, rotten curiosity to know how you'd feel about it. She pursed her lips, musing darkly. I wonder, she began. Have you been true to me? Not that I've got any right to ask, or that it makes a bit of difference in my young life whether you have or not, but just... She broke off, leaning forward, studying his face as he looked at her in silence. Carrie, why don't you say something? I would care. I'd care like hell. I came back, he said slowly, because you are the one and only woman in the world for me, and always have been since I saw you. Is that enough answer? From any other man in the world, it wouldn't be an answer at all. From you, it's enough. Will you marry me, Pat? She jumped to her feet, walked over to the window, and looked out to where the clematis blooms trembled in the wind. Oh, I suppose so, she said fretfully, if you want to take the chance. What chance, dear love? The chance every man takes that marries a girl of the kind you men all seem to want to marry. How many of the married set here do you suppose are true to their husbands? I don't like you cynical, Pat. You've been letting something poison your mind. Not me. I see things as they are, that's all. Ask Con, ask Dee, ask Bobs. Ask any of 'em. You know you could have had Con if you'd really wanted her, and then I butted in. Her chuckle was full of diablerie. It still persisted in her tone as she continued. Carrie, what would you do to me if I went straying off the reservation after we were married? Nothing. Oh, don't be so calm and superior and noble about it, she fretted. You'd tempt an angel to try a flutter just to see whether she would get by with it. What do you want me to say, Pat? I want you to tell me honestly how you think you're going to hold me if I do marry you. Come over here. She walked across to him, defiant, daring, provocative. Well? You love me, don't you, Pat? You make me when you're with me. And when I'm not? That's just the trouble. You're there all the time, parked just around the corner, and you won't let me love anybody else enough to do any good. And if I asked you now, he said low and insistent, you'd come back to me and be to me what you were before, wouldn't you? There was a quickening in her shadowed eyes, in her soft breathing. You know I would, she whispered. How could I help myself? Then you couldn't very well marry anyone else, could you? I've tried. It was a fliv, as you know. What's the answer? Isn't it plain enough? Why not try me? On your own terms. Where do you get that own term stuff, Carrie? She demanded suspiciously. Do you know about Dee and Jimmy, their arrangement? No. It's a secret. But you belong to us, she added sweetly, to the Fentresses. So I'll tell you. They were to stay married for a month, and after that, if either of them wanted to quit, they were just to live like unmarried people without any fuss. Only Jimmy wouldn't keep to it. That's what made the row. Would you like to try that plan? He asked in an inscrutable tone. Would you do it? She looked at him doubtfully. Would you really let me go after a month if I wanted to? After a day? Do you think I'd try to hold you against your wish? Then I don't think you can love me much, she objected with perverse jealousy. It strikes me as a perfectly fair bargain to both. I certainly ought to be willing to take the chance, he said reasonably. If you are? If I am? Carrie? You mean that you might want to leave me? A startled incredulity made the words jerky. One can never be quite certain how these things are going to turn out, can one? He observed with a fine air of judicial detachment. Shall I have my lawyer draw the agreement? Carrie, you're laughing at me, she accused. Far be it from me in matter of such serious import. You are. You're hateful. It isn't fair. You know that's the way to hold me, and you know you don't mean to get me loose for a single minute. I don't like your knowing so damn much about women, she continued plaintively. It makes it so uneven. I'm trying to be fair, he pointed out. He drew a chair up to the writing desk. Suppose I just sketch out the scheme. This agreement, he dictated to himself, speaking the words slowly, between Patricia Fentress... Scott, she interposed. Scott, thank you, dearest. And Carrie Scott for the space of 1 month after... She bent across his shoulder, put a soft hand over his mouth, then slipped it aside to make place for the yearning of her own lips. When she finally leaned back from him, it was to say judicially, I offer an amendment. Let's make it 20 years instead of a month. But oh, Carrie, darling. Her eyes darkened, brooded, dreamed, grew somber, subtle, prophetic, as she gave voice to her warning. As a husband, you'll have to be a terribly on-the-job lover. There are so many men in the world. End of chapter 35. End of Flaming Youth by Samuel Hopkins Adams.